Chapter 26:18. At this moment, the boundless heat seemed to have turned into living creatures and began to wriggle rapidly on the seal. Streams of heat began to move around the seal like countless cultivators. All sorts of strange, extraordinary powers emerged from the heat and gradually intertwined with each other and influenced each other. Along with this change, all sorts of strange splendor began to appear in that part of the world, and it became inexplicably mysterious. At a glance, it seemed as if an indescribable light mist had enveloped this part of the world. The originally distinct heat had been completely concealed at this moment. At that moment, the cultivators who were cultivating nearby were suddenly alarmed by the commotion below. One by one, they woke up from their cultivation and turned their gazes towards the source of the laws of ice. They stared at everything that was happening in the depths of the source of the laws of ice. "What's this?" The 5 cultivators were all inexplicably shocked. At this moment, they only felt that they could not believe what they were seeing. What did they see? They saw that Luo Fan had directly bestowed the heat he emitted with spirituality. They saw that he had bestowed countless extraordinary powers to the heat. As cultivators who had cultivated in this part of the world for tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of years, they knew better than Luo Fan how difficult this was. At this moment, as soon as they saw this scene, they instantly knew how difficult it was. They also understood how much stronger Luo Fan had suddenly become to be able to do all this. This degree of strengthening was simply as terrifying as a mortal suddenly becoming a self-sufficient connate zenith heaven cultivator. How can he do this in this part of the world? Is this person even more terrifying than that person? At this moment, such emotions arose in their hearts, and inexplicably shocked expressions appeared on their faces. At this moment, they suddenly felt that waiting here did not seem to have any meaning at all. Perhaps, in the end, they would only be able to see that cultivator easily deal with that person that they feared? Faced with this situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. He seemed to have comprehended something and felt indescribable joy, as if he had discovered an achievement that he had dreamed of. He raised his hand and waved it. His movements were gentle and soothing, as if there was an extremely fragile object in his hand that began to dance along with his movements. As he moved, an indescribable aura faintly emanated from his body. At this moment, everything around him seemed to have become a part of him, falling into his control. The source of the cold laws that originally repelled him, and even allowed him to use this rejection to comprehend the mysteries of the source of the countless laws of heat, seemed to have been completely tamed at this moment. They began to revolve around his body and vaguely formed a strange vortex. It was as if Luo Fan's body was a black hole that had an endless attraction to the source of the laws of the surroundings. At this moment, in that part of the world, the countless extraordinary powers and radiances that had come to life had truly interwove together. After the splendors intertwined, they began to fuse with each other. Through this fusion, countless things that normal light couldn't produce were gradually born. For example, the laws of the laws, the great Tao, time, space, or, to be more precise, it was the world. The countless splendors condensed and changed. In the blink of an eye, they had already enveloped the world, forming a world beyond the world. After this world was formed, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of control from the bottom of his heart. This part of the world was completely formed by the heat that he released. The great Tao, the laws and laws, the time and space, and even all the energy and matter in it were all under his control. More strictly speaking, it was under his absolute control. At this moment, with a slight jolt in his heart, he had already sensed that this world was actually empty. Although it seemed to be a complete world on the outside, it was already an extremely mysterious and profound existence. But inside, as long as one slightly broke through the surface layer of this world, one would be able to see the truth of this world. This world was, in fact, a world of nothingness. Although everything else was extremely complete, Even the Great Tao was extremely impressive and perfect. At a glance, the entire world was just a void. Although this void was vast and boundless, in the entire void, only the icy world at the center was separated from the void. It was the only physical existence in this world. From a certain point of view, this world was clearly still not enough to be considered a satisfactory world. However, it was clear that for Luo Fan, such a piece of land was already enough. At the very least, it had already satisfied his current needs, and it was enough for him to use this world to achieve his goal. In that case, it should be fine. This thought flashed through his mind. With a slight thought, the spacetime in that world began to change. The originally stable flow of time began to undergo an earth-shattering change. All sorts of unimaginable changes appeared in the flow of time, causing the flow of time in that world to either accelerate, decelerate, distort, or go in the opposite direction. In the blink of an eye, the spacetime in that world that seemed like a void had already been divided into billions of small individuals and small parts. Along with this change, the flow of time at the center of this region, where the icy world was located, had also changed. There, the flow of time was also not stable, nor was it unique. Instead, it also produced all sorts of indescribably complex changes like the outside world. Similarly, there were distortions, cracks, acceleration, deceleration, or even random changes. All sorts of changes in the flow of time were directly added to a certain region. If that region could completely adapt to the changes in time, then it would be fine. At most, it would only create some regions that had a slightly unique flow of time. However, if that region itself had its own characteristics of spacetime, and it had to stabilize above a certain flow of time, then the result would obviously not be so peaceful. The moment this change occurred, an intense conflict would naturally appear. And at this moment, this conflict also erupted between this icy world and the world that Luo Fan had opened up using heat. The distorted and changing flow of time collided with the icy world at this moment, creating an extremely intense conflict between the two. In this conflict, whether it was the icy world or the world that Luo Fan had opened up, both began to violently shake. Time was an important foundation that formed the world. Time, space, matter, and energy. These four existences were almost like the four pillars of the world. If any one of them shook, it would be an incomparably profound change to the entire world. At this moment, the time of the two worlds clashed, causing the time of both worlds to change. The impact on both worlds was extremely shocking. The world that Luo Fan had opened up, which was constructed from heat, trembled continuously. Countless cracks appeared on the world's surface, causing countless cracks to form out of thin air. This caused the source of the cold laws in the surroundings to be stirred up, and it even began to surge into the cracks in that world. The world that Luo Fan had opened up was affected to such an extent, and the icy world would only be more affected. After all, the source of all these changes was controlled by Luo Fan. This also meant that he had actually long been prepared for this kind of conflict and shock. Since he was prepared, he could naturally take advantage of the situation and use various methods to reduce the impact of this conflict, so that the damage to this world would not be as severe. In comparison, the icy world did not have this kind of convenience. For the world where the flow of time had already been slowed to a billionth of the outside world, the entire process from the time Luo Fan broke through to the composition of the world, to the change in the flow of time, and then the intense impact on the icy world's flow of time, could be said to be less than a billionth of an instant. In such a short period of time, even if the icy creature reacted, it would not be enough to change the entire world, nor would it be enough to implement its stabilizing methods to every corner of the world. Under such circumstances, this sudden conflict was of course equivalent to encountering it without any preparation for it. In this way, the impact could be imagined. In an instant, the entire world of ice had been split into countless parts by the different changes in the flow of time. Countless cracks appeared on the surface of the world of ice, completely splitting the world of ice apart. It looked as if it was formed from many parts glued together. Along with this change, the flow of time in the icy world also became extremely chaotic. When different flows of time clashed, the greatest impact would naturally be on the flow of time. In this kind of conflict, some places would be victorious, while others would naturally be defeated. In particular, under the changes that Luo Fan had specially targeted, the one that obtained victory and the advantage was naturally the world of heat that Luo Fan had opened up. Hence, in this kind of conflict, the region that obtained more victories was naturally the world outside. And Luo Fan's goal was to break the extremely slow flow of time in the icy world. He wanted the flow of time to return to normal, or even faster than normal. Under such circumstances, after his victory, the flow of time that he had changed would naturally become faster. As this change occurred, the flow of time in the entire world had already begun to accelerate. A portion of it had begun to accelerate, which meant that the ice creature's original preparations to face Luo Fan's attacks, like a tortoise that was withdrawing its head, were no longer effective. Originally, this method could only succeed because that world was one. The outside world could not ignore the flow of time and invade that world. If he wanted to invade that world, he could only follow the flow of time that had been changed and slowed down. By relying on this special characteristic, he was able to stop Luo Fan, maintain himself in front of him, and persevere for a longer period of time. But now, this integrity had already disappeared. The flow of time in the entire world had already been split into countless parts. Although there was still a large portion of the flow of time that was slowed down, it was many times slower than the outside world. But for Luo Fan, who had already invaded that world, it no longer had much of an impact. At this moment, he could already easily destroy other regions, causing this region to become more and more dilapidated and smaller. In the end, he would destroy the remaining regions where the flow of time was slowed down, and finally split the ice creature out, allowing it to fall into his control. Faced with this situation, a strange expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. He seemed to be looking forward to it, but he also seemed to be a little excited, as well as vaguely comprehending something. As he constantly changed the flow of time in that world and constantly manipulated the flow of time to attack the flow of time in the world of ice, the conflict between the two became more and more intense. There were fewer and fewer regions where the flow of time in the world of ice was slowed down, and the area became smaller and smaller. Why is it so fast? At this moment, the ice creature that had been condensed from the heavenly Tao side, its expression filled with pity. In the outside world, many years had already passed, but in this world of ice, only an extremely short amount of time had passed. It could be said that at this moment, he had only just finished thinking about what he had thought before, and his final thoughts had not even passed. However, in such a short amount of time, he could no longer maintain the stability of this world, and could only watch as the world was split into countless parts. How could he not be shocked? How could he not feel pity? However, although he was shocked by this result, he also knew that this result was actually reasonable. Chapter 26:19. The ice creature sighed and stopped restricting the flow of time in the world of ice. As a result, the flow of time in the world of ice became synchronized with the outside world in the blink of an eye. Of course, at this moment, the conflict between the flow of time in the icy world and the flow of time in the outside world completely disappeared. The world that was about to be split into countless fragments stopped collapsing in the blink of an eye. Luo Fan, who was outside, naturally sensed this development clearly. After all of this happened in the world that he had opened up. At this moment, a faint smile appeared on his face. He knew that he had already won the first step. Then, with a thought, space and time warped, and the world of ice completely disintegrated, turning into countless fragments. Like an asteroid belt, they were scattered chaotically in that world. Nearly 80% of the creatures in the frigid world died because of this change. The upheaval of the world itself was the greatest disaster for creatures. The fact that 20% of the living beings were still alive was because there were many complete ecological environments in the fragments of the world that had been cut off. Among the countless fragments, there was one that seemed extremely special. It was the fragment where the ice creature was. At this moment, the fragment was like a circle of light that wrapped around the ice creature. As for the fragment, it looked like it was just a circle of light and the ice creature. At this moment, the icy creature looked in Luo Fan's direction with an indescribable expression. Its eyes seemed to be able to penetrate all obstacles. Even the barriers of the world and the origin of the laws of ice did not seem to exist to its eyes. This time you win. I just hope that you can escape quickly. Otherwise, if my main body catches up to you, your outcome will not be good, the ice creature said. The words were not loud, but Luo Fan heard them clearly. When Luo Fan heard this, he smiled faintly and said, "Escape? I've never thought of escaping. Before I finish cultivating here, I don't plan on leaving." Hearing this, the ice spirit's expression changed slightly. A probing look appeared in its eyes, as if it wanted to see if Luo Fan was being sincere or if he was just being stubborn. In the end, he could only admit that either the other party really thought so, or the other party's acting skills were so strong that he couldn't see through them at all. Immediately, he shook his head and said, "Since that is the case, let us wait and see." As he spoke, he did not wait for Luo Fan to make a move. His body trembled, and his entire body instantly collapsed. The aura that belonged to a living being and the charm that belonged to a living being had completely disappeared in just a few short moments. He would rather destroy himself than be killed by Luo Fan. Luo Fan furrowed his brows. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion in the air. The world that he had opened up had already undergone various subtle changes. A powerful sealing force descended from the sky and pressed down on the ice creature, trying to seal all traces of the ice creature. However, it was a pity that even though Luo Fan was fast enough, he was still a step too slow. In the end, when the sealing force arrived at its target, there was no trace of the ice spirit. It was even to the extent that even if he continuously traced back time and reverse time, he was still unable to find any trace of the ice spirit's existence. How decisive! After some investigation, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. Because of the ice spirit's final actions, even though he had obtained victory, the joy of victory had been greatly weakened. After a long while, he finally got rid of the unpleasant feeling in his heart and regained his composure. Then, with a thought, that part of the world trembled slightly, and everything within it was instantly erased. Even the world itself collapsed and died during this process. Even the heat that formed the world was instantly annihilated in the blink of an eye. In just a few breaths of time, the depths of the laws of cold had returned to the state that Luo Fan had seen it for the first time. Of course, what he saw back then was the appearance that the ice spirit had concealed. Now, what he saw had become the true appearance of this place. Creating a world in the depths of the laws of cold brought convenience to cultivation. Through the world itself, one could absorb the boundless laws of the outside world, and then use one's own connection with the world to experience these laws and convert them into one's own. This could indeed reduce the difficulty of comprehending these laws, and the speed at which one could absorb the laws was 10 times or even 100 times faster than directly absorbing them. Unfortunately, this wasn't Luo Fan's Tao. He didn't come here purely to absorb the source of the laws of cold outside. He came here to use the endless source of the laws of cold outside to stimulate the source of the laws of heat that he had already absorbed into his body. With this stimulation, the mysteries hidden in the source of the laws of heat, which he couldn't sense or study before, would be revealed. This would allow him to integrate even more mysteries from the source of the laws of heat into everything he had. Under such circumstances, what was the point of absorbing the endless source of the laws of cold outside? Since there was no point in absorbing it, The method of speeding up the absorption would naturally not be of much use to him. This was why Luo Fan had so decisively dispersed the world. Originally, he had dispersed the world because the existence of this world wasn't helpful to his cultivation. However, when he completely dispersed this part of the world, he suddenly noticed that along with the disappearance of this part of the world, the origin of the cold laws actually seemed to have shed some sort of shackles, and it revealed an indescribable feeling of ease. Under this relaxation, the stimulation of the source of the laws of heat in Luo Fan's body actually strengthened. The changes in the depths of the source of the laws of heat, which had originally gradually calmed down, became obvious again. This was clearly an unexpected gain for Luo Fan. At this moment, the 5 cultivators outside the source of the laws of cold also sensed a similar change. When the world completely dispersed, they felt that the nutrients they could absorb from the source of the laws of cold had suddenly skyrocketed by several times. As a result, the process of cultivation, which originally required a lot of hard work, suddenly became extremely simple. However, this still wasn't the change that they were most happy about. What made them the happiest was that at this moment, they could already feel that the death penalty that they had received had suddenly been reduced by as much as 60 to 70%. This change was clearly because some kind of existence had suddenly shared the death penalty with them. Such a change could be said to be a dream come true for them. However, they immediately understood that this was their enemy. The existence that caused them to die once in the eyes of this world was already dead. He succeeded. These thoughts echoed in the minds of these cultivators at this moment. With this thought, it was as if they had put down a huge burden in their hearts. They felt extremely relaxed, and the mental burden that had shackled them for tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of millions of years, had been lifted in the blink of an eye. However, along with this relief, there was also a sense of loss and emptiness. It was like the feeling of loss and emptiness after taking revenge. What should we do next? This thought surfaced in their minds involuntarily. The reason why they were able to maintain such a strong fighting spirit all these years and stay near the ice field even though there seemed to be no hope was because of the hatred in their hearts. Now that the target of this hatred had been erased, to them, this was equivalent to taking away the target that they had supported for tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of millions of years. Even though these cultivators were not ordinary cultivators and were extremely powerful beings themselves, they could not help but feel various emotions after successfully taking revenge at this moment. However, these cultivators were not ordinary after all. This feeling of loss did not linger in the hearts of these cultivators for too long. Not long after, they came back to their senses one after another. 3 cultivators sighed and bowed to Luo Fan, who was in the depths of the source of the laws of ice, before turning to leave. The remaining 2 cultivators also expressed their gratitude to Luo Fan. However, after expressing their gratitude, they did not leave. Instead, they directly opened up a cave in the depths of the ice field, near the source of the laws of ice, and directly moved in to continue cultivating. Perhaps they wanted to seize this extremely rare cultivation environment and work hard to improve themselves, or perhaps they were waiting for the true form of the ice creature. As for the specific intentions, only they knew. Just as these living beings were shocked and overjoyed, in the hidden cave abodes on the ice field, the cultivators who were unwilling to leave or enter the ice field also sensed something. Did they succeed down there? One of the cultivators murmured, his expression filled with disbelief. They did not dare to enter the ice field below, which in itself meant that they did not believe in Luo Fan's strength. They did not believe that Luo Fan would be able to obtain the final victory. If they believed this, why would they still be wandering around here? Did they not know that regardless of whether Luo Fan succeeded or failed, they would not gain anything from this? Since they did not dare to go down even though they knew this, it was obvious what they were thinking. It was precisely because they had this thought that they discovered that Luo Fan had actually obtained the final victory. The ice creature that caused their death had actually been erased by Luo Fan. Now that most of their death punishments had been taken care of, they were so shocked and could not believe it. While they were still in shock, 3 figures soared into the sky from the ice field below, turned around, and flew into the distance. These cultivators immediately recognized the 3 figures and knew that they were 3 of the cultivators who had gone down to the ice field. The cultivators immediately became anxious and sent voice transmissions to the 3 figures. They wanted to ask them what had happened down there, and if what they sensed was true. However, it was a pity that the only reply they received was, "You can all leave now." Apart from that, no matter how much they asked, there was no reply. After all, they had some ties with these cultivators, so they could not directly stop them. In the end, they could only watch as the 3 cultivators disappeared before their eyes. After the 3 cultivators disappeared, these cultivators looked at each other, unable to decide what to do next. In the end, they were divided again. Some chose to believe in the 3 cultivators who had left, some chose to continue waiting, and some chose to head down to the ice field, planning to personally explore the situation down there. Luo Fan, who was below, naturally did not care about the various entanglements of these cultivators. In fact, the 2 cultivators who chose to stay here did not care at all. At this time, they were just taking advantage of this good cultivation environment and working hard to cultivate. Whether it was for Luo Fan or the 2 cultivators, this was the most perfect opportunity for them to cultivate since they had entered the ice field. Just like a spring, the more it was pressed down, the greater the rebound force would be. Before this, the origin of the law of cold was shackled by the heaven and earth. It was difficult for it to truly express the principles and mysteries it possessed, and it was difficult for it to display the various laws it contained. Now that the shackles had disappeared, it naturally began to rebound. It displayed its various aspects with unprecedented clarity, and it displayed its characteristics with unprecedented intensity. As a result, for the cultivators who had comprehended and absorbed the laws through the origin of the law of cold, this was naturally a once-in-a-lifetime cultivation opportunity. Although only a short while had passed, Luo Fan already felt that his gains from 10 days to half a month would not be as much as what he had gained in that short period of time. If even Luo Fan was like this, then those cultivators who had their death penalty suddenly relaxed and felt the unprecedentedly active source of the cold law would only have a greater harvest, not a lesser one. Chapter 26:20. At this moment, every cultivator in the ice field had made great progress. In just a short period of time, these cultivators had all made progress that they had originally planned to spend tens of millions of years to achieve. Moreover, apart from this progress in cultivation, they also had an indescribable feeling. Vaguely, the death punishment that had been imposed on them for at least tens of millions of years seemed to have loosened a little. This loosening was not strong, and if it was taken out alone, it might not even attract the attention of the cultivator. However, the lingering charm that this loosening represented was beyond imagination, because this meant that they already had the hope to completely eliminate this death penalty. Looks like as long as we get rid of the clone that killed us, we'll have a chance to completely escape the punishment. At this moment, the 2 cultivators looked at each other and saw indescribable joy in each other's eyes. As cultivators who had lived with those cultivators for tens of millions of years, they knew very well what the other cultivators who had left this ice field would do. Most of them would leave this world, and a small portion would head to other places like this ice field to explore the source of the laws. In the end, about half of them would stay in this world, and among this half of the cultivators, perhaps half would choose to settle down somewhere and ease the various terrifying pressures that had accumulated over the years. In the end, there were only 1 or 2 cultivators who did not stop cultivating like them and continued to explore the mysteries of cultivation and work hard to improve themselves. This was already a very exaggerated number, and among these 2 cultivators, it was impossible for anyone to improve as much as they did. Without such great improvement, it was naturally impossible for them to discover the loosening of the death penalty. If they could not discover the loosening of the death penalty, it would be impossible for them to break this death penalty and escape the torment that had been lingering around them for tens of millions of years. In other words, it could be said that among the many cultivators who sought revenge from the ice creature, only the two of them could truly obtain the greatest benefits. Thinking of this, they could not help but feel extremely fortunate, but they also felt an inexplicable lingering fear. Fortunately, they had chosen to stay here and continue cultivating. What he was afraid of was that, if he had made a wrong decision back then and made a different choice, what would his fate be like? Directly wasting the opportunity of this world was secondary. The most important thing was that from now on, the seed of defeat would be planted in his heart, and it would be a great hindrance to his future cultivation. Amidst all these inexplicable thoughts, they couldn't help but feel grateful towards Luo Fan again. Although Luo Fan had not done much these days, his actions had still brought them enough benefits, allowing them to obtain this fundamental and crucial improvement. No matter what, this was worthy of their gratitude. One of the cultivators sighed and pointed at Luo Fan. As he pointed, a strange light came out of his hand and quickly rushed toward Luo Fan. This speck of light was extremely peculiar. Although it was extremely fragile, it seemed as if it could be completely extinguished with just a ripple in the air. However, after it appeared, the surrounding ice and the source of the laws of cold directly treated it as if it did not exist. There was no change at all because of its existence. Under such circumstances, the speck of light easily penetrated through the layers of obstacles and appeared in front of Luo Fan. This kind of change was naturally completely sensed by Luo Fan. The instant the speck of light was about to hit him, he raised his hand and caught it. He held the speck of light in his hand as if it was a physical object. "What is this?" Luo Fan turned his head to look and frowned slightly. The cultivator looked at Luo Fan and said, "You have done me a great favor, and I have no way to repay it. I can only express my gratitude with an invitation letter." A great favor? Gratitude? No need. Although Luo Fan was quite interested in the invitation letter, he still said this. As he spoke, he raised his hand and sent the speck of light forward. The speck of light flashed and appeared in front of the cultivator. Then, before the cultivator could react, the speck of light had already crashed into his body. "I only did what I did for myself. If you can obtain benefits, that is your own fate. It has nothing to do with me," Luo Fan said. At this moment, the cultivator finally reacted and looked at Luo Fan with a completely different gaze. "Do you know what kind of invitation letter this is?" he asked in disbelief. "No matter what kind of invitation letter it is, I won't accept it if I don't deserve it," Luo Fan said. He could naturally guess how precious this invitation letter was. A treasure that could make a cultivator who had suffered for tens of millions of years refuse to take it out no matter what. Even if it was not more precious than his life, it was probably comparable to it in his heart. He was very curious about this invitation letter. That wasn't nonsense. Of course, he was extremely curious. Did he want it? That was even more obvious. He had entered this world to search for fortuitous encounters and to improve himself. This invitation letter was not simple. No matter how he looked at it, it could bring him great benefits, so how could he not want it? However, curiosity and wanting it were two different things compared to actually keeping the invitation letter. When he decided to drive these cultivators away and then completely ignore them, he had already decided that there was no friendship between him and these cultivators. Regardless of whether they were unlucky or lucky, whether they suffered great losses or obtained great benefits, to him, they were merely strangers who encountered strange encounters. They had nothing to do with him. Under such circumstances, how could he calmly accept the invitation letter that these cultivators gave him out of gratitude for the benefits they obtained? Fellow Taoist, do you know that if you didn't have this invitation letter, you would have to spend billions of trillions of years to obtain the essence of this world? that person said in disbelief. I didn't know before. But now I know, Luo Fan said. From the cultivator's words, this invitation letter was very important, and it might even be related to the location of the true opportunities in this world. However, Luo Fan did not feel any regret because of this. It was not that he was dismissive of this invitation letter and opportunity. Instead, he was confident that he did not need to use this method to obtain this invitation letter. He did not need to use this method to obtain the opportunity to compete for the opportunity. What this cultivator could do, he could definitely do it too. If this cultivator could find this invitation letter, he could definitely find it too. Even though he didn't know what the invitation was, who sent it, or where he could go after obtaining it, he still didn't know what it was. Since fellow Taoist knows about it now, I believe you have changed your mind, right? Fellow Taoist, please accept this invitation letter, the cultivator said. Looking at his expression, he seemed to be somewhat relieved. Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head lightly and said, No, I haven't changed my mind. This invitation letter is not mine, so I won't accept it no matter what. The cultivator almost went crazy at this moment. How could there be such a thing? Such a great opportunity, such a great benefit. He had already made up his mind to give it away, but the other party did not accept it at all. He had clearly explained how great and rare the benefits were. At this moment, the cultivator not far away from this cultivator gradually recovered from his daze. He looked at this cultivator with a strange gaze. The emotions in the depths of his eyes were extremely complicated. Clearly, he had already figured out what kind of invitation the cultivator was talking about. It was also because of this that he was even more shocked. He had known this cultivator for hundreds of millions of years. Although they had initially met because they were in the same boat, had a common enemy, and had a common goal, they had known each other for hundreds of millions of years. However, after spending so many hundreds of millions of years together, he believed that he had completely understood this cultivator in front of him. In fact, he had even completely grasped this cultivator's way of thinking. He knew that this cultivator would react in a certain way when encountering certain situations. However, after so many hundreds of millions of years, he actually could not see that this cultivator was hiding such a big secret. How could there be such an invitation letter? Have you lost your mind? With such an invitation letter, do you need to spend hundreds of millions of years waiting here for revenge? Take this invitation letter out and find someone to help you take revenge. Isn't it just a matter of saying a word? At this moment, his mind was on the verge of collapsing. This world was vast and boundless. Even the cultivators who had been here for hundreds of millions of years did not know how many experts there were. However, among the powerhouses they knew, the ice creature was definitely not the strongest. Even though they knew that there were more than 100 experts stronger than the ice creature, they still couldn't believe their eyes. Among these experts, there were definitely many who were interested in this invitation letter. More than half of them were willing to offend the ice creature for this invitation letter. As a result, if this cultivator was willing to hand over the invitation letter, then no matter who he gave it to, not to mention dealing with the ice creature's incarnation, even dealing with the ice creature's original body wouldn't be a difficult task. However, even though this cultivator had such confidence, he did not reveal anything for hundreds of millions of years. In fact, he would rather waste hundreds of millions of years near this ice field and wait in vain for a chance to take revenge that might never appear. This kind of mentality was not something the cultivator could understand at all. At this moment, he only had one thought. This cultivator in front of him was crazy. Although the cultivator did not know how his companion was criticizing him, he knew that his current actions would not be approved by the other party. Therefore, he had no intention of paying attention to his companion and only wanted to persuade Luo Fan to accept this invitation letter. It went without saying how firm Luo Fan's will was. Since he had already made his decision, He naturally could not change his mind just because of some word. Therefore, no matter what the cultivator said, he could only shake his head and refuse. He was unwilling to accept the invitation letter. It was as if the invitation letter was some kind of poison or something negative. That cultivator tried to persuade him for a long time, and found that Luo Fan was actually very firm. He really didn't want to accept this invitation at all. He could only look at Luo Fan with an inexplicable expression. That expression was very similar to the expression his companions had when they looked at him. It was as if they were looking at a madman. At this moment, he completely understood what his companions thought of him. There's actually such a madman in this world. Why did we enter this world? Isn't it for opportunities? Now that there's such a good opportunity in front of me, I actually rejected it just because it's not something I deserve. This kind of person is definitely crazy. At this moment, he thought of the changes that occurred when other cultivators were faced with benefit. The kind where close friends directly turned hostile and the originally tender feelings directly turned into ferocious and murderous changes. The feeling that Luo Fan had already gone crazy became even more intense. Suddenly, he thought of something and turned around to look at his companions. The moment he looked over, he saw the extremely complicated light in his companions' eyes. That light seemed to be a little unbelievable and incomprehensible. There was also a hidden desire and even greed, although this desire and greed was only a little and didn't suppress other emotions. This kind of trend was enough to make the cultivator feel a chill in his heart. For the first time, he regretted taking out this invitation letter. As expected, too strong of a temptation is indeed a disaster for friendship. He secretly sighed in his heart. With a thought, that speck of light emerged from the depths of his body, and the light it emitted instantly became stronger. In the blink of an eye, the light had become thousands or tens of thousands of times brighter. Chapter 26-21. Then, an indescribably mysterious existence suddenly appeared in the air. After this mysterious existence appeared, it instantly locked onto the cultivator. Or, more accurately, it locked onto the spirit light inside the cultivator's body, the invitation letter. Whether it was Luo Fan or the other cultivator, both of them were extremely intelligent. At that moment they understood what the cultivator meant at the same time. This was clearly not willing to test their friendship with the other cultivator. After discovering that Luo Fan really did not want to accept the invitation letter, the cultivator directly used it. Seeing this, Luo Fan only nodded inwardly. This cultivator's actions were extremely wise. Friendship could not be used to test one's relationship. No matter how deep a friendship was, it could not withstand a test. If one valued a friendship, one should not use benefits to test the other party and not give the other party a chance to betray you. Perhaps for some creatures, a friendship that could be shaken and could not withstand a test was impure, and it did not matter even if it was abandoned. However, in the end, such an existence was bound to be all alone. As for the other cultivator next to the first cultivator, the expression on his face kept changing. Some were ashamed, some were glad, some were angry, and some were happy. All sorts of emotions intertwined together, and it could only be described as complicated. In the end, he could only let out a sigh and say to the cultivator, "I hope we can meet again in the future." The cultivator smiled and nodded. His figure was pulled by the mysterious existence, and in a flash, he disappeared without a trace, as if he had never been there. At this moment, the cultivator who stayed here sighed inwardly. He bowed to Luo Fan and turned to leave. Luo Fan naturally did not say anything about his departure. He only glanced at him and threw him to the back of his mind. At this moment, the focus of his attention was on the mysterious, formless existence that had appeared out of thin air earlier. That mysterious and formless existence had obviously appeared because of the invitation. Even if he wasn't the sender of the invitation letter, he must have an extremely close relationship with the sender. At that moment, he felt that behind that mysterious existence, there was an incomparably grand and vast world vaguely connected. That world was so mysterious that even he could only vaguely sense traces of its existence. Furthermore, it was only because the invisible mysterious existence had an indescribable connection with that world that he was able to vaguely sense such traces. But even if it was just a trace, it was enough for her to clearly understand the wonders of that world. The aura exuded from that world was filled with the charm of laws. It wasn't the kind of law that existed between the heavens and earth, but the kind of law that originated from the source of law. Generally speaking, there were also endless laws in this world. However, those laws were mainly used to determine the nature of everything in this world, the way everything interacted with each other, the effect that everything could have in this world, and so on and so forth. Although they were complicated, complete, and mysterious, those laws weren't of much use to cultivators at Luo Fan's level. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, the principles of cultivation had long surpassed the laws of this level. In comparison, the laws in the source of laws were different. Although they were also nomological rules, these nomological rules were related to the principles and mysteries of cultivation. Moreover, compared to the laws that filled the entire world, there were trillions of times more of them. Under such circumstances, there might not be much difference between the two laws, but for cultivators, the difference was like the difference between heaven and earth. Just now, he had sensed the aura of the laws in the source of laws in that world. What that represented was too obvious. It could be said that in that world, even the most ordinary and ordinary areas contained the amount of the origin of laws that were extremely beneficial to cultivators. It was probably comparable to the amount of laws in the origin of laws. In other words, in that world, the entire world could be said to be a source of laws that was trillions of times larger than any other source of laws. Moreover, it was not just a simple one. Just like the two sources of rules that Luo Fan had encountered before and the two sources of rules that he had encountered this time, it was a source of rules that only showed a single nature. Instead, it had countless manifestations, and it contained almost all the substances and phenomena that a normal world should have. Just by thinking about it, one could tell how beneficial it would be for a cultivator to enter such an existence. Even if Luo Fan didn't take the path of absorbing and integrating the endless laws of the outside world, he would definitely be touched after entering it. As a result, his analysis and research of the heat law source in his body would be many times smoother than it was now. After knowing this, it was obvious what Luo Fan was thinking. Of course, he would find a way to enter it. He wasn't willing to accept the cultivator's invitation because he didn't deserve it. However, it wasn't because he didn't care about the sender of the invitation. At this time, he took advantage of the opportunity that the mysterious invisible existence had just arrived to carefully experience the characteristics of that mysterious existence. He tried his best to grasp the mysterious existence's aura, wanting to use his own efforts to step into it without the help of the invitation letter. This wasn't a simple task. In fact, it could be said that it was an almost impossible task. The cultivators who were able to enter this world were definitely the pinnacle existences in the cultivation world of their respective world. It would naturally be an exaggeration to say that any one of these existences could be compared to Luo Fan. However, it would definitely be reasonable to say that their levels weren't too far off from Luo Fan's. Under such circumstances, the cultivators who had entered this world billions of years ago still couldn't figure out a way to enter that world without the help of the invitation. No matter how extraordinary Luo Fan was, what could he do? Could it be that he could complete a project that they couldn't complete in billions of years in such a short period of time? As such, although he tried his best to explore that world and study the traces that the mysterious and invisible existence might have left behind, he didn't gain anything even after several years. It was as if that invisible existence had never existed. It was as if that world had never existed. He could not find any trace of it at all, let alone dig out the truth behind it and find a way to enter that world through thin air. Looks like I still need the invitation. Several years later, Luo Fan sighed and finally stopped his futile efforts. If he could see hope, let alone several years, even if it was tens of thousands of years, millions of years, or tens of millions of years, he would still have the patience to continue exploring. However, it was a pity that he couldn't see any hope during these few years. What he knew was still the same. What he knew back then was still the same. What he didn't know back then was still the same. Under such circumstances, no matter how stubborn he was, he understood that he would only be wasting time if he continued like this. If there's such an existence, there might be other similar existences. This thought emerged from the bottom of his heart without him noticing, and it gave him a strong desire to explore. However, this was a matter for the future. At this moment, the source of the cold law was more important to him. Perhaps if he searched for the invitation now, he would be able to enter that world faster and obtain a better cultivation environment. Compared to staying here and cultivating, he might be able to obtain greater benefit. However, everything was built on the possibility. He might be able to enter faster, and he might be able to obtain greater benefit. However, what if this possibility didn't happen? A bird in the hand was better than 10 birds in the bush. Placing one's cultivation hope on the possibility was something that no wise cultivator would do. Luo Fan was obviously a wise cultivator. Therefore, even though he knew that he might be able to obtain greater benefits by leaving this place, he didn't leave. After all, compared to that possibility, the benefits he could obtain by staying here were real. As long as he studied diligently, as long as he worked hard, he would be able to continuously obtain more and more benefits from the source of the cold law around him. This would allow him to improve in all aspects. In that case, how could he not know what he should choose? In the process of Luo Fan wholeheartedly cultivating, time passed by slowly. Before he knew it, 10,000 years had passed. During these 10,000 years, Luo Fan didn't move at all. He merely floated in the depths of the source of the cold law like a dead object. During this process, the source of the cold law gradually underwent various subtle changes. In a short period of time, no one would be able to notice such subtle changes. However, after 10,000 years of accumulation, the changes had reached a certain limit. Finally, the entire origin of the law of cold had completely changed. Now, while the source of the cold law was releasing boundless coldness, a large amount of heat was surging out of it. The heat was extremely mysterious. As it traveled through the depths of the ice field, it gradually melted more and more of the ice field, turning the ice into clear water that kept seeping out of the ice and settling at the bottom of the ice field. After 10,000 years, the surface of the ice field didn't change much. However, at the bottom of the ice field, there was now a rather deep ocean. This ocean filled the bottom of the basin, and as time passed, it kept expanding. What expanded the ocean wasn't just the melting ice from the heat released by the source of the cold law above. More importantly, when the ice at the bottom came into contact with the seawater, it kept absorbing the heat from the seawater, causing the ice that came into contact with the seawater to melt and turn into seawater that flowed into the ocean below. Because of this change, the originally extremely cold temperature of the entire ice field had unknowingly increased by quite a bit. Of course, compared to the drastic changes below, this increase was still extremely small. At least, it wasn't enough for ordinary living beings to sense. Naturally, it wasn't enough to change the ecological environment of the ice field, and it wasn't enough to increase the number of living beings here. The reason for this change was actually very simple. It was because Luo Fan was cultivating in the source of the cold law. The effect was relative. During the process of cultivation, Luo Fan was constantly being affected by the source of the cold law, and the heat law source in his body was constantly being stimulated by the source of the cold law. In that case, the source of the cold law was naturally also being affected by the source of the heat law. Compared to the strong influence of the source of the cold law on the source of the heat law, the influence of the source of the cold law on the source of the heat law was actually not that strong. However, this kind of influence existed all the time. Compared to Luo Fan, who could transform the influence of the source of the cold law on the source of the heat law into stimulating the details, allowing him to comprehend the heat law more deeply, the effect of the source of the cold law on the source of the heat law could only accumulate. In this way, as long as enough time passed, there would naturally be obvious effect. For example, the current situation where the heat melted the ice and formed an ocean under the ice field wasn't surprising at all. Of course, this was also because Luo Fan had monopolized the source of the cold law at this moment. If it was before, with the ice creature suppressing this place, the reaction of the source of the heat law on the source of the cold law could be easily eliminated by the ice creature. In that case, no matter how long it took, it wouldn't be able to change the situation of the ice field. Since the ice field had undergone such a change, Luo Fan's change would naturally only be greater than before, but not smaller. After 10,000 years of cultivation, Luo Fan's study of the source of the heat law had unknowingly reached a depth that he couldn't have imagined back then. The most obvious sign of the in-depth study was that the transcendent quality in the heat inside his body was at least 10,000 times stronger than before. Chapter 26-22. Generally speaking, the power that was condensed by cultivators with extraordinary characteristics could be called magic power. However, there was obviously a world of difference in the power condensed by cultivators of different levels. Therefore, although it was also magic power, there were also many levels of magic power. Different cultivation systems naturally had different standards and explanations for the specific division of these levels. However, no matter what cultivation system, what standards or what theories they had, the essence of power was still there. This was because all of them contained extraordinary characteristics. Therefore, fundamentally speaking, at least from the perspective of an existence like Luo Fan, the essence of magic power was the same regardless of the level. The reason why there was such a huge difference in the power derived from the same essence was actually very simple. It was just a difference in quality and quantity. It could be said that the difference between magic power that had just taken form and magic power that was truly powerful was like the difference between a cloud of water vapor and a boundless ocean. The essence of water vapor was the same as seawater in the ocean. They were both formed by water molecules. However, due to the huge difference in quality and quantity, if one of them formed water vapor, it would completely disperse in a few breaths if there was no way to preserve it, let alone when it encountered flames. The other one was an ocean. Not to mention staying in normal space-time, even a boundless ocean of fire could only be extinguished in front of it. At this moment, the heat energy in Luo Fan's body seemed to have undergone a metamorphosis compared to the heat energy in the past. It surpassed the difference in quality and quantity between water vapor and the ocean. At this moment, he felt that the origin of the law of chill in front of him was not as vast as it used to be. With the support of the origin of the law of heat in his body, when he looked at the origin of the law of chill in front of him, he only felt that the law of chill in front of him was a little extraordinary. The reason was naturally that he had already unknowingly reached an extremely profound level of control over the origin of the law of heat in his body. He had finally reached a level where he could barely be on the same level as the origin of the law of chill in front of him. Strictly speaking, there was still a gap between his control over the origin of the law of heat and the origin of the law of chill. However, a level was still a level. At a lower level, when he looked at the source of the cold rule in front of him again, his perspective naturally returned to normal. Originally, the feeling that it was unfathomable, as if it could not be reached no matter how much one explored it naturally could not continue to exist. This was naturally a good thing, and it represented that his improvement during these years had already reached a level that he didn't even dare to imagine in the past. But at the same time, from another perspective, this wasn't a good thing either. This meant that the stimulation from the origin of the law of chill, or rather, the stimulation from the origin of the law of heat in his body, had become hundreds or thousands of times smaller than before. Why was the origin of the rule of cold able to make it easier for Luo Fan to comprehend the principles and mysteries of the origin of the rule of heat? The fundamental reason was that the source of the law of cold was sufficiently deep and unfathomable. Because it was deep and unfathomable enough, the source of heat in his body resonated strongly with it. This resonance caused many details at the extreme depths of the source of the law of heat to become obvious, causing the principles and mysteries contained within to gradually be revealed. But now, the profoundness and unfathomability of the source of the law of cold had already disappeared, and the resonance between it and the source of heat had naturally decreased by who knew how many times. After such a decrease, the details in the depths of the source of the law of heat naturally could not be highlighted, and Luo Fan naturally could not continuously dig into the principles and mysteries within like before. Sensing the turbulence in the source of the law of heat in his body that had not deepened for many days, Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly. Looks like I won't be able to obtain the main body of the ice creature after all. Waiting for the main body of the ice creature to arrive was naturally one of his reasons for staying here. However, that was not his main goal. To Luo Fan, what was truly important was his own cultivation. If he could wait for the main body of the ice creature to arrive while cultivating here, he would naturally welcome it. However, if waiting for the main body of the ice creature to arrive would instead affect his cultivation, he would not do such a thing no matter what. At this moment, it was obvious that continuing to cultivate here would already affect his cultivation progress. Hence, even if he was still curious about what the main body of the ice creature would look like and what methods it would have, Luo Fan did not intend to continue waiting here. There's no point in staying here any longer. It's time to leave. With that thought in mind, Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had already left the source of the law of cold and entered the icy plains, arriving before a strange vortex. This vortex was none other than the one he had constructed to protect the old world. It was the vortex that had isolated the old world from the outside world so that the old world would not completely collapse. The flow of time in the world within the vortex was much faster than the outside world. Now that so many years had passed in the outside world, the time in the world within the vortex was naturally even longer. By now, there were only a few living beings left in the world that still remembered the appearance of the world before the vortex had appeared. Apart from these few living beings, the world that all other living beings in the world knew was like this at this moment, being enveloped by a huge vortex. Under such circumstances, they had even imagined that the world should have such an appearance. Even some of the otherworldly worlds described in some literary works in this world vaguely had such a shadow. At most, it was just a transformation on this basis. At this moment, Luo Fan arrived here. After sensing it slightly, he confirmed that the world within the vortex was completely complete. The endless cracks that originally existed in that world had already healed at some point in time. Now the entire world was complete, and it was no longer possible to tell that it had almost completely collapsed in the past. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that there was no longer a need for the vortex he had constructed to exist. At that moment, he did not hesitate and casually waved his hand. The vortex paused for a moment before suddenly collapsing. The heat in the entire vortex completely collapsed, turning into countless fragments that directly integrated into the surrounding ice field. Following the trajectory of the coldness in the ice field, it directly flowed into the ocean below. In just a few breaths of time, it had already disappeared without a trace. At this moment, almost all living beings in the world within the vortex instantly felt the changes in the world. For a moment, countless living beings suddenly raised their heads to look at the sky. The huge vortex that originally covered the sky had completely disappeared without a trace. An unprecedented clarity appeared in front of everyone's eyes. At the very least, in the eyes of those living beings who did not know the world before the vortex formed, it was unprecedentedly clear. Then what? The sky broke? At this moment, who knew how many living beings felt an indescribable panic in their hearts? For something that was originally extremely familiar to suddenly disappear at a certain moment was a great shock to any living being. Moreover, to those living beings who were born during that time, the vortex was simply a part of the world. In fact, it could even be said to be an indispensable part of it. At this moment, when the vortex suddenly disappeared, to them, they could not help but wonder whether the world was about to collapse, and whether the end of the world was about to arrive. To Luo Fan, all sorts of panic and worries were naturally quite laughable. If he had the mood to look at it, in reality, for Luo Fan, dispersing the vortex was actually equivalent to cleaning up the mess he left behind, completely dispersing the last trace of him in this ice field. However, it was not that he was interested in the living beings inside. Therefore, at this moment, after dispersing the vortex, he just calmly turned around and left. He did not pay any attention to the world inside the vortex at all. In a flash, Luo Fan had already left the ice field. Compared to the time when he needed to use all sorts of subtle techniques to control heat to achieve the effect of flight, the current Luo Fan did not need any techniques at all. Just by relying on the extraordinary characteristics of heat itself, he could already fly in the sky and burrow into the ground at will. At this moment, when he stood in the air, it was really no different from an ordinary person standing on the ground. At a glance, he saw the cave dwellings hidden in the void. These cave dwellings were none other than the cultivators who had been thrown out by Luo Fan back then. At this moment, not all the cultivators in those cave dwellings had left. In reality, there were still cultivators waiting and cultivating in a few cave dwellings. However, perhaps there was not much difference between these living beings and Luo Fan in essence. Nevertheless, their essence was ultimately only their essence. After all these years of development, the strength that they were able to display in this part of the world had already been left far behind by Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan did not want to be discovered by them, they would not be able to discover his existence no matter what. Even though Luo Fan was sensing their situation and observing their changes unscrupulously at this moment, it was the same. Luo Fan did not alarm them. After sensing his surroundings for a while, he soared into the sky and randomly chose a direction to shoot out. As the heat that he condensed gained more and more extraordinary characteristics, the various abilities that he originally possessed gradually returned. Of course, to put it more accurately, it was gradually revealed in this world. And intuition was one of the abilities that he had found. For example, at this moment, it seemed like he had just randomly chosen a direction to advance in, but the direction that he had subconsciously sensed was the direction that could bring him the most benefits. In other words, although he had just randomly chosen a direction, the possibility that he could find the so-called invitation letter, another more powerful origin of laws, or other things that would be helpful to him was higher than other directions. From a certain point of view, he could now be considered to be able to do as he pleased. Currently, the strength that Luo Fan could exert in this world was already at the level of a supreme emperor. The power of his abilities was so great that it could be said that he was almost omnipotent. If it was not for the fact that this world still had restrictions on extraordinary abilities and that his various methods were still greatly restricted, he might have been able to cross endless distances in an instant and appear in a certain location that his intuition had locked onto, witnessing the wondrous existence that would bring him many benefits. Even so, his speed had almost reached the limit that this world could accept. He turned into a stream of light in midair, leaving behind a long trace of light in the void. At a glance, it was as if there was an invisible brush drawing a long stroke in midair. This world was vast and boundless. Although Luo Fan had encountered many cultivators before, that was only because there was a source of laws of cold in that location that would bring great benefits to cultivators. However, it did not mean that there were a lot of cultivators in this part of the world. It was a long sword. In a normal, unspecial area, the number of intelligent beings in this world was extremely low, and it could even be said that there were almost none. Evidently, this was normal in any world, and there were no special areas that had more intelligent beings. After all, if there were fewer intelligent beings, then a normal and unspecial area would be special in itself. Therefore, the long afterimage he left in the air only made the countless living beings below feel confused. There were very few living beings that could know that a powerful cultivator was passing by in the air. It could even be said that there were almost none. Just like that, Luo Fan flew for nearly a month. If one were to use precise values to calculate the distance of a month, it would probably be calculated in billions of miles. Chapter 26-23. This mountain peak was an extremely ordinary one. At the very least, compared to the most ordinary mountain peaks that Luo Fan had seen in this world before, there was not much difference in essence. It was ordinary in size, ordinary in height, ordinary in concentration of vitality, ordinary in vegetation, and ordinary in distribution of living creatures. Everything seemed to be the same as any other mountain that could appear in any region in this world. The reason why Luo Fan came to this place was because there was a kind of attraction that existed to him here. This attraction was extremely subtle and faintly discernible. If it were not for the fact that Luo Fan had already raised the heat that he could control to an unbelievable level, he might not even be able to sense this subtle attraction. The moment this mountain descended, a subtle wave was transmitted from the mountain into Luo Fan's body. It made him involuntarily walk in a certain direction on the mountain. After turning around a few stones, he saw a faint light emitting from the ground. This light was extremely peculiar. Although it was essentially light, it appeared to be extremely stable, as if it was a real object. When it appeared here, it felt as if it was a kind of solidified crystal. Because of this, Luo Fan did not notice the existence of this light high up in the sky. After all, with his eyesight, even if this light was extremely high up in the sky, even if this light was 1,000 times weaker, he should still be able to see it. It's a bit like that invitation. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and waved it slightly. The sand and soil below began to tremble slightly. Then, the sand and soil naturally dispersed, revealing the real source of light below. It was a bit of spiritual light. This was the same spiritual light that Luo Fan had seen in the invitation back then. It was an invitation letter. It's really following one's heart's desire, and one's wishes come true. Luo Fan could not help but feel a little emotional at this moment. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and waved it. The spiritual light had already left the ground and directly landed in his hand. As soon as the spiritual light entered his hand, he discovered that it was engraved with a large amount of information. This information outlined a peculiar charm, vaguely pointing to another world. The other was the world that Luo Fan had felt before, the world that was connected to the invisible and strange existence. Obviously, this really was the invitation letter. Although he had already obtained the invitation, Luo Fan did not activate it to enter that world. This was because he vaguely felt that it was still not a good time to enter that world. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and an inexplicable expression appeared on his face. He casually put the spiritual light into the storage space constructed by the heat in his body, then his figure shot into the sky and quickly flew in a certain direction. This time, his senses were much clearer than before. The target he sensed was also more intuitive than before. He could sense that if he headed in this direction, it wouldn't be long before he encountered the true body of the ice creature. Now, it could be said that Luo Fan already had a way out. Even if he could not defeat the ice creature's true body, he was absolutely confident that he could enter that world with the help of the invitation letter and escape the ice creature's true body's attack. In such a situation where he could attack or retreat, what Luo Fan should do couldn't be more obvious. After advancing like this for a few days, he had unknowingly arrived at the surface of the sea. This sea was nothing compared to the entire world. Compared to land, it could even be considered insignificant. Strictly speaking, it could even be considered a lake. After all, there was land in all directions. The entire sea looked like a huge pit that was dug out from the land and filled with seawater. He could feel the void trembling in this place. Some kind of existence with extreme temperature was rapidly descending from outside the space, descending towards the sea through some kind of method. Sure enough, it's his real body. At this time, Luo Fan already had a realization in his heart. This extremely low-temperature existence was approaching in an extremely subtle manner. The level of life revealed was at least one level higher than that of the ice creature's incarnation that Luo Fan had sensed back then. Of course, this referred to the level of life that it could display, but it did not involve its essence. If it was its essence, it naturally would not stop at this level. It's a good opponent. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he attacked without hesitation. He raised his hand and pointed at the void. A huge amount of heat was released from his body, turning into a three-legged cauldron in the void, and fiercely falling towards the void. A terrifying suppressive force instantly enveloped the entire void. Under this suppressive force, the existence that was descending towards this space seemed to have directly collided with an incomparably sturdy wall, and a strange sound rang out. This sound was very strange, and its penetrative power had reached an unimaginable level. At this moment, countless cracks appeared in the void. These cracks were densely packed, and they covered the entire void above the sea, making it seem like the void above the sea was formed by countless fragments glued together. However, although these cracks had appeared, due to the existence of the suppressive force, these cracks could not truly expand at this moment. The fragments also could not completely collapse because of this, nor could they completely break away from their original structure. At this moment, one could only see the cracks continuously appearing and spreading, but it was impossible to see the cracks actually widening to the point of collapse. "Who is it?" At this moment, a furious roar came from behind the space. This roar contained boundless killing intent, and it even caused a subtle change in the weather. Although this voice was not completely the same as the ice creature's incarnation, its tone and charm were exactly the same. Evidently, the existence that spoke had an incomparably close connection with the ice creature's incarnation. This made Luo Fan even more certain that the creature was the ice creature's original body. "You can't even withstand my suppression, and you still want to deal with me?" Luo Fan said indifferently. As he spoke, the three-legged cauldron trembled slightly, and the suppressive force surged once again. Furthermore, it became even more refined, and in an instant, it had already seeped into the crack and started to spread out towards the creature's location. "Damn it!" The creature roared furiously again. As it roared, Luo Fan felt that the suppressive force that he released with the help of the three-legged cauldron had encountered an unimaginable obstruction. Under this obstruction, the suppressive force shattered bit by bit, turning into countless fragments that surged in all directions. The countless fragments became even finer, and the cracks became even more concentrated. At a glance, it was difficult to see what cracks and fragments there were in the void above the ocean. One could only see that the void above the ocean had become a little blurry. It was as if there was a thin layer of fog covering the sky above. It also seemed like there was an extremely meticulous layer covering the sky. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan had an indescribable expression on his face. He thought to himself, as expected, it's impossible to block his path so easily. At this moment, a huge, sparkling and translucent silhouette rushed out of the cracks. That figure looked exactly the same as the ice creature. It was so much so that even the quality was not much different from the ice creature. Another incarnation? At this moment Luo Fan frowned. However, he discovered that the crystalline figure was not the creature's actual body. Instead, it was a clone that was similar to the ice creature he had seen at the origin of the cold law. The ice creature's original body was still behind the void, behind the countless cracks. At this moment, the ice creature appeared and its body trembled. Suddenly, a world appeared and expanded in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it covered the entire ocean. It enveloped the entire void above the ocean. Immediately after, the ice creature raised its hand and the entire world started to change. The endless laws, and even the great Tao started to exert their power in one direction and began to pull the existence behind the world towards this world. During this process, the ice creature's body, which was also its sparkling and translucent body, began to rapidly disintegrate. Countless fragments and even powder started to fall from the creature's body, gradually fusing with the world, the endless laws, and even the great Tao. Evidently, it was not an easy task for the sparkling and translucent figure to execute all of this. At the same time, thunderous roars rang out from the back of the world. The sound became louder and more shocking as time passed. In the beginning, it was only faintly discernible, but soon it became earth-shattering. Even the sound waves alone had created all sorts of indescribable, extraordinary effects. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan was only stunned for a moment before he immediately took action. With a thought, the three-legged cauldron formed from heat trembled and a terrifying suppressive force descended. However, compared to before, this suppressive force directly targeted the world created by the ice creature's incarnation. It targeted all the laws, power, and great Tao in that world. The three-legged cauldron's only use was to suppress, absolutely suppress. This suppression penetrated every aspect of that world and reached the great Tao in the depths of that world. Under this suppression, any action taken by that world would consume even more energy and pay an even greater price. The most obvious thing was that as this suppressive force descended, the crystalline figure's speed of collapse started to accelerate. The body that could originally last for a few days was completely exhausted in just a few minutes. As the ice creature's body was completely exhausted, the world it created became a tree without roots, a water without a source. It could only gradually collapse. Gagaga sounds were constantly being released from the heavens and earth. Due to these sounds, the world started to crack and turn into more and more fragments. These fragments were not suppressed by the three-legged cauldron's suppressive force, so they could not maintain their original state at all. After they cracked open, they started to shatter and scatter in all directions. In the end, it didn't take long for all the fragments of the world to vanish without a trace, as if they were never there in the first place. However, just this alone was enough for that living being. At this moment, a palm had already stretched out from the countless cracks in the void. This palm's outline was exactly the same as the ice creature's palm, but it was made of flesh and blood, not ice. It was not crystalline. This palm was dripping with blood, and there were countless wounds on the surface of the palm. It looked rather tragic. At this moment, the hand stretched out of the countless cracks and grabbed onto the surrounding cracks. In the crack, he exerted force and tore apart the countless fragments around him, causing the countless fragments around him to collapse in an instant. The suppressive force that was suppressing the cracks didn't have much effect in this direct collision. Then, a figure covered in blood gradually emerged from the countless collapsed fragments. Similarly, its outline was similar to that of the ice creature, but it was also made of flesh and blood. At this moment, this creature was surrounded by a tangible anger and killing intent, and an imposing aura soared into the sky, directly into the clouds in the sky, causing more than half of the clouds in the sky to disperse. "I want you dead." After this figure appeared, its eyes instantly locked onto Luo Fan. All sorts of murderous intent and anger surged towards Luo Fan's location in an instant. "Looks like you paid a huge price," Luo Fan said indifferently. Chapter 26-24. At this moment, the cultivator stared at Luo Fan with a look of realization in his eyes. He seemed to have recognized what kind of person Luo Fan was. At this moment, Luo Fan looked at the living being in front of him and secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Although this cultivator's control of his own power had reached the acme of perfection, and there was almost no aura related to the level of power being revealed, Luo Fan could still infer from various traces that the cultivator in front of him should be at the same level as his current level. Of course, this referred to the strength that could be exerted in this world. As long as this living being was not a true sage, he would not think that he was weaker than the other party. "I didn't look for you, but you came to me instead." "Good, good, good," the cultivator said coldly. As he spoke, the energy in his body surged, and all the wounds and bloodstains on his body disappeared without a trace. He looked as if he had completely recovered to his most perfect state. Even if it was an injury caused by spacetime, it was just a superficial wound that could be healed with a thought for existences of their level. "A clone is not enough to make up for the mistake you made," Luo Fan said. This sentence had already expressed his mentality and thoughts incisively and vividly. As long as the cultivator was not stupid, he should obviously know what he was talking about. By letting the other party understand his intentions, Luo Fan had already answered all of the cultivator's doubts, and it was already very benevolent of him. Therefore, after saying this, Luo Fan did not hesitate at all. He raised his hand, and the endless heat in his body surged out of his body and continuously formed in the void. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a concept ability and rushed towards the cultivator. Although the suppression effect of the three-legged cauldron on the cultivator was not obvious, the suppression power it released was still extremely terrifying. It was impossible for such a terrifying suppression power to not have any effect. Although it couldn't directly target that cultivator, it could target the spacetime around that cultivator and the laws around that living being. At this moment, although the cultivator could still unleash his full strength, the effects of his strength were heavily suppressed. The suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron acted like a buffer layer, constantly leaking away the cultivator's movements, strength, and attack. Under such circumstances, although the cultivator himself wasn't affected much, he couldn't exert much strength at all. It was as if the restrictions and suppression of this world on him had suddenly increased by several times. In fact, this method was what Luo Fan had comprehended from the suppression method of this world. This comprehension caused the suppression power that he had unleashed at this moment to undergo a subtle change compared to before. It vaguely became more profound, and more profound. Faced with this situation, the cultivator's expression turned ugly. But obviously it was just ugly. After all, he was a terrifying existence that could cultivate from a mortal to a supreme emperor in this world. Even if Luo Fan's attack method was extremely exquisite and mysterious, he wouldn't be completely helpless because of this. At this moment, sensing the suppression power and the terrifying might contained in the concept God art, the cultivator let out a soft groan. Gusts of cold intent surged from his body, creating a source of cold laws that directly blasted towards the concept God art constructed from heat that Luo Fan had unleashed. This source of cold laws was 30% larger than the source of cold laws that Luo Fan had comprehended for so many years. The moment it appeared, it already distorted the surrounding spacetime, causing the terrifying suppression power released by the three-legged cauldron to seem to lose its focus. It began to slide away along the surface of the source of cold laws, and in the end, it couldn't really exert its force on the cultivator at all. Following this change, the suppression power's effect on the cultivator had decreased by countless times. In the end, the source of cold laws collided with the concept God art that Luo Fan had released at the critical moment. The concept God art itself had countless changes. It seemed like it was just forcefully suppressing the cultivator, but there were endless changes occurring within it at every moment. Its own nature would change countless times with the flow of the ideas within. In comparison, the source of cold laws was not inferior at all. As the source of laws, although it was only the source of laws that the cultivator had condensed, the source of laws was still the source of laws. Every strand of laws contained endless cultivation principles and mysteries. How many changes could be derived from the combination of these countless laws? At this moment, the source of cold laws collided with Luo Fan's concept God art. In just an instant, the two of them underwent changes that could be calculated clearly multiple times. Every single change emanated a variety of unimaginable fluctuations that stirred the boundless space in the surroundings and shook the extremely dense laws and laws in the surroundings. It was even to the extent that the suppressive force emanated by the three-legged cauldron was unable to endure this impact at the first possible moment, and it was directly minced into pieces before being obliterated into nothingness in the end. Circles of ripples continuously spread out from the point of collision between the two. It was as if a huge rock had been thrown into calm water. During this collision, Luo Fan's expression gradually became grim. Amidst this, he no longer hesitated. Waves of heat surged out of his body and formed concept God art in the void. Moreover, these concept God arts also formed corresponding combinations at the same time, forming something that resembled a world, and fiercely pressed down on the cultivator below. That's right. This time, the target of his attack was not the source of cold laws released by the cultivator, but the living being's body. Faced with such an attack, the cultivator sneered. Without any movement, the source of cold laws suddenly expanded. From the point where it could only block one concept God art, in the blink of an eye, it expanded to the point where it almost filled the entire world. It directly blocked all the angles of contact between Luo Fan and it. Boom, 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 earth-shattering explosions erupted from the point where the world formed by the concept God art and the source of cold laws came into contact. Compared to before, the situation this time was different. Previously, the clash between the concept God art and the source of cold laws seemed to be in a stalemate. If one were to really strictly distinguish them, the source of cold laws still had the upper hand. However, this time, the situation was extremely obvious. The world formed by the concept God art that Luo Fan had constructed obtained an absolute advantage. In that collision, the origin of the law of ice continuously collapsed, as if countless invisible blades were frantically slicing at the surface of the origin of the law of ice. The originally smooth surface was gradually sliced into countless fine fragments, and in the end, it turned into dust that scattered in all directions. Chi. At this moment, all sorts of sounds of space-time being penetrated came from all directions. They came from the shockwave caused by the collision between the world formed by the concept God art and the source of cold laws. Obviously, because the shockwave contained all sorts of inconceivable might, it didn't just shake the spacetime in this area, it even forcefully broke through the stability of this spacetime and formed all sorts of tearing effects on it. Along with Luo Fan's actions, the concept divine ability that he had sent out automatically approached the world constructed by the concept divine ability. Not long after, it had completely integrated into the world and became a part of it. On the other hand, the three-legged cauldron also slowly approached that world. Soon, it had also completely integrated into that world. The reason why it went so smoothly was naturally because the essence of the two was the same. The three-legged cauldron and that world seemed to be two completely different existences. However, don't forget what made them. The three-legged cauldron was directly formed by the intense extraordinary heat in Luo Fan's body. That world seemed to be formed by the concept God art. However, That concept god art was also formed by the heat in Luo Fan's body. That way, one would naturally be able to find out the similarity between the two. Since there was such a similarity, the fusion of the two would naturally be successful. There was no need to force it at all. As the three-legged cauldron also integrated into that world seemed to have obtained some sort of core. Its power became more and more powerful, and its crushing effect on the source of the law of coldness became more and more obvious. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had an inexplicable expression on his face. There was anticipation, excitement, curiosity, and even doubt in his eyes. At this moment, the cultivator that was being suppressed moved again. He snorted coldly. Suddenly, boundless mysterious light surged out of his body and instantly added to the source of the law of coldness. With the addition of the mysterious light, the source of the law of coldness suddenly changed color. It was originally a ball of white light, but it instantly turned black. It was just like the color of the mysterious light. Along with this change, the source of the law of coldness gave off a subtle sense of firmness and eternity. It was as if it had suddenly turned from tofu to steel. The degree of firmness seemed to have increased tremendously. Along with this change, Luo Fan felt that it was becoming more and more difficult for the world formed by his concept god art to suppress the source of the law of coldness. Although he was still gaining the upper hand and was still inching closer to victory, the speed was becoming slower and slower. It even felt like it was going to completely stop. Seeing this, Luo Fan had a look of realization in his eyes. Although he had lost the victory that he had been so close to obtaining. Instead, he wasn't that disappointed. After all, this scene was in line with his previous estimation of the cultivator. That cultivator was an extremely powerful being. Previously, Luo Fan had almost been tricked by him, and he had given up all of his nutrients for growth. How could such a being only have the means that he had displayed before? This was also the reason why he had such a complicated expression earlier. Now, although the resistance that the cultivator displayed had eliminated his chance of winning, at least it was in line with Luo Fan's estimation of him. An existence that could almost scheme against him should be this powerful. However, although he came to a sudden realization, it didn't mean that he was willing to remain in such an indecisive state. Therefore, in the next moment, Luo Fan didn't hesitate at all. He once again performed various god arts that he had. One after another, he used the heat that contained extraordinary characteristics that he had condensed to cast them. As the changes changed, they kept pouring down on the cultivator. At the same time, the cultivator had no intention of admitting defeat. Facing Luo Fan's attacks, he did not hesitate to use the corresponding means to deal with it. At this moment, it could be seen how deep this cultivator's foundation was. Every time Luo Fan's means were beyond the limits that the cultivator could deal with, he would suddenly use a means that Luo Fan had never seen before to reverse the situation. Just like that, the battle went on for 3 years. During these 3 years, the attacks and defenses that they exchanged with each other had to be calculated in the hundreds of trillions. The location where they were fighting was no longer above the original ocean. Although the location was still the same, the terrain below had been completely changed. The ocean had disappeared and the surrounding land was covered in cracks. It looked like it was riddled with scars and holes. It was so much so that it was hard to imagine what it looked like before it was restored. Both sides of the battle, whether it was Luo Fan or the cultivator, although they didn't look much different from before, whether it was their aura, or even temperament, they had undergone tremendous changes. Chapter 26-25. If one lost a battle in this world, unless one was extremely unlucky, it was impossible for one to die. After all, the cultivators who could enter this world had reached an extremely high level. However, the strength they could display in this world was far below this level. Just like Luo Fan and that cultivator, they could display the strength of a supreme monarch, and this seemed extremely terrifying. It was enough to completely overturn space and time within a radius of hundreds of millions of kilometers, plunging this place into the end of the world. However, this level of strength was far too lacking compared to their intrinsic qualities. It could be said that in a normal world, even if they appeared in front of a supreme monarch without any defense, the supreme monarch would not be able to truly harm them even after spending hundreds of millions of years. In other words, the strength they could display at this time was actually unable to shake the intrinsic qualities of both sides. In this case, it was naturally impossible for their lives to be truly in danger. Of course, the prerequisite for this was that they were not extremely unlucky. After all, this world was vast and boundless. No one could say for sure what kind of experts were hidden in it and what kind of unimaginable dangers there were. If they were truly unlucky enough and encountered some kind of danger that exceeded what their intrinsic qualities could withstand, then there was naturally nothing much to say. However, even though they would not encounter true danger and would not truly die, this did not mean that this kind of battle would not harm them. Just like how this world could suppress the strength a cultivator could display without destroying their intrinsic qualities, this world could also make a cultivator receive a death-like punishment before they died. As long as it believed that one should die after suffering such a blow in this world, it was just like the many living beings that were schemed to death by the ice creatures. After they were schemed to death, they suffered constant torment. Back then, thousands of cultivators were schemed to death. In the end, only a dozen or so cultivators persevered due to the hatred in their hearts. They did not give up on the opportunity in this world because of this torment. From this, it could be seen how difficult this torment was to endure. Whether it was Luo Fan or that cultivator, they were extremely clear about this kind of death punishment. Obviously, not a single one of them was willing to endure this kind of punishment and this kind of torture. In this case, how could they not give it their all in the battle? As the stalemate continued, both of them felt the possibility of defeat. Naturally, a strong desire to win emerged in their hearts. In this battle, the cultivators seemed to have an endless number of trump cards. After one was broken, another would appear, and after that, another would appear. It was almost endless. It could be said that no matter what methods Luo Fan used, what divine abilities, and even the heavens and the earth, they would still be obstructed by the trump cards Luo Fan revealed one after another. In this manner, after 3 years, Luo Fan's heart had gradually given birth to an inexplicable sense of crisis. If this goes on, we really might not be able to deal with him. Unknowingly, this thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The reason why he had this thought was because over the past 3 years, he had displayed trillions of offensive and defensive method. He had almost exhausted all the offensive and defensive changes of the heat in his body. Now, although he could still think of a way to continue, he could still continue to innovate. However, this was only temporary. If this went on, in at most half a month, he would exhaust his limited abilities and repeat his previous attack. After all, the time he has spent in this world is much longer than mine. Although the path he has taken isn't as specialized as mine, and he can't compare to me in terms of the excavation of power. However, the path he has taken has maximized his advantage of time. In terms of trump cards, I still can't compare to him. Gradually, this kind of understanding appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The path that Luo Fan had taken in this part of the world was one of specialization. In other words, he had grasped a type of power, raised it to the limit, and unleashed it to the limit. In the end, he would use this power as the foundation to unleash all the methods he had in the past. In contrast, the path taken by the cultivator that he was facing now was completely different. The path he had taken was the path of broad mastery. The meaning of the path of broad mastery was that he didn't dig deeply into the magical use of a single type of power. He didn't continuously improve and sublimate a certain type of power. Instead, He used his original methods to find all kinds of substitute powers and combine them together to form his own various abilities, powers, and magical powers. Specialized and broad mastery were two completely different methods. If it was within a short period of time, the advantage of specialized was naturally greater. After all, the path of specialized was to use a certain type of power to replace one's previous power. All one needed to do was to find a way to convert this type of power to his previous power. As long as this was found, then the countless previous experiences could be put to use. However, broad mastery was different. What broad mastery needed was to collect different types of power to directly reconstruct his previous power. He had to try his best to combine these powers with the various magical powers, spells, and powers that he had created in the past. Under such circumstances, if he didn't have enough types of power, the strength that he could unleash was naturally quite limited. And if he wanted to collect enough types of power, obviously, time was indispensable. If he didn't have enough time, how could he find a variety of power that he could use in this vast world? Therefore, it was clear that in a short period of time, the cultivator who walked the specialized path would obviously be able to unleash more strength than the cultivator who walked the broad mastery path. However, it was clear that the premise couldn't be clearer. If it wasn't for a short period of time, the situation would obviously be completely reversed. For the broad mastery path, the more types of power he collected, the closer the power he could combine would be to his previous power. In this way, the power that his divine powers, and spells could unleash would naturally be closer to his true power. In contrast, the specialized path was different. After all, the specialized path was only unearthing and improving a type of power. And no matter how much this power was improved, it was still a type of power that wasn't compatible with the cultivator. No matter how much this power was improved, no matter how much it was unearthed, using it to unleash the various divine powers, spells, and powers of the past, the effect would never truly reach its previous level. In this way, the longer one took, the more perfect one's power, divine powers, and spells could be unleashed. On the other hand, no matter how long one took, there would inevitably be a certain limit. It was simply impossible to perfectly unleash the power of those divine powers, and spells. In the end, it was needless to say who had the upper hand and who would be at a disadvantage. It could be said that between the specialized and broad mastery paths, one was to focus on the present, while the other was to give up on the present and focus on the future. Strictly speaking, the broad mastery path had a brighter future, based on the power that could be unleashed in this world. From this point of view, it was clear that the cultivator in front of him was someone with a long-term vision. Of course, although he had lived in this world for God knows how many hundreds of millions of years, in reality, this period of time was not considered long at all. However, in reality, this period of time was not long at all compared to the entire world and to him. At least, this amount of time was not enough for him to obtain the greatest benefits of the broad mastery path. It was precisely because of this that he could fight back and forth with Luofan. He simply could not unleash his most powerful divine powers and directly destroy Luofan. In fact, it was also because the broad mastery path required too much time. With Luofan's current conditions, it was impossible for him to waste so much time here. That was why he did not choose the broad mastery path, but the specialized path instead. Don't forget that for Luofan, the seventh tribulation was still hanging over his head. Compared to the broad mastery path, 300 million years was probably just the beginning. At least, based on the power in Luofan's body under normal circumstances, if he wanted to truly find a combination of powers that could completely replace the effects of these powers, he would probably need to search for at least tens of millions of powers and carry out incomparably complicated combinations before he could barely achieve it. If he could achieve true perfection, this number would probably be tens of thousands of times more with so many powers, let alone 300 million years. Even if it was 3 trillion years, Luo Fan might not be able to achieve it. Moreover, this had to be based on the situation where there were so many powers in this world. If this world was not as vast as he imagined, and lacked a certain power, then it would be impossible for him to achieve perfection no matter what. With such a weakness, it was obvious that Luo Fan could not choose the broad mastery path no matter what. Apart from the problem of time, there was a more important reason why he did not choose this path with a brighter future. That reason was none other than the reason why he entered this world. He had entered this world in order to improve himself and prepare to face the 7th Great Tribulation. How could it be for the sake of becoming an expert in this part of the world and displaying even greater strength? Spending a large amount of time on this would instead neglect his own cultivation, causing his own cultivation speed to slow down. This was clearly putting the cart before the horse. Of course, what Luo Fan could see, other cultivators could obviously see as well. However, different standpoints would obviously lead to different thoughts. To them, the most appropriate way of doing things would naturally be different as well. For Luo Fan, time was very tight. If he chose the broad mastery path, it would naturally be putting the cart before the horse, or even courting death. However, for cultivators who did not have much time and had a lot of time to waste in this world, choosing the specialization path was short-sighted. Therefore, it was obvious that Luo Fan's choice of the specialization path and that cultivator's choice of the broad mastery path were actually not right or wrong. To them, the other party's choice was wrong, and their own choice was the right one. Luo Fan thought that the other party was putting the cart before the horse, while the other party thought that Luo Fan was short-sighted. Luo Fan did not persist in this dilemma for too long. The current situation was that although the time that the cultivator took on the broad mastery path was not too long, at least according to the time needed for the broad mastery path, this amount of time was enough for him to accumulate far more experience than Luo Fan. If he kept revealing his trump cards like he did in the past 3 years, the one who would eventually lose would definitely be Luo Fan. After understanding this, Luo Fan, who originally did not intend to take the risk, could only bite the bullet and take the risk. However, this might be a good opportunity. As this thought flashed across his mind, his figure suddenly retreated, and he had already retreated hundreds of millions of miles. He had already left the desolate battlefield hundreds of millions of miles in front of him. Has he given up? At this moment, the cultivator was slightly taken aback. He swept his gaze around and had already locked onto Luo Fan, who was outside the battlefield. The reason why he had such a thought was simple. It was because Luo Fan's current performance was too similar to that of a deserter. However, this thought did not persist in his mind for too long. Very soon, he discovered that the situation was not as such. This was because he clearly felt an inexplicable pressure shrouding his heart. This kind of pressure was so powerful and so wonderful that it made him feel as if he would encounter a calamity that could completely destroy him in the next moment. He's preparing a terrifying attack. At this moment, how could he not understand what was going on? After understanding this, he did not dare to be negligent. As his figure flashed, countless kinds of power emerged from his body, forming a world in the void. In a flash, he had already arrived hundreds of millions of miles away. At the place where Luo Fan was, he blasted at Luo Fan fiercely. With his rich combat experience, he naturally knew that allowing Luo Fan to prepare his attack at this moment was the most foolish thing to do. The distance in space was almost meaningless to existences at Luo Fan's level. Even though they could only unleash the strength of a supreme emperor in this world, it was still the same. Therefore, even if Luo Fan had retreated hundreds of millions of miles away, for the cultivator, it was not much different from being in front of him. Chapter 26:26. At this moment, countless lights and shadows emerged from his body and overlapped in an extremely mysterious and indescribable way in the void, turning into a state that was like a living thing. "What's this?" Seeing this, the cultivator felt an indescribable shock in his heart. He was obviously not from the Tao Master Great World, nor was he a cultivator from the Tao Master Path. If he was a cultivator from there, he would definitely be able to recognize that what Luo Fan had condensed was the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. Although it was just a speck of light, the moment it appeared, space-time could not bear the burden. The surrounding space-time seemed to have turned into extremely fragile glass under this light. Countless cracks began to spread from the light in all directions, as if the light was going to bring Luo Fan to an indescribable place. Compared to space-time, Luo Fan's performance was better. However, there was a limit to it. At this moment, cracking sounds were constantly coming from his body, as if something incomparably sturdy inside his body was starting to crack. At this moment, Luo Fan's complexion became extremely pale, even to the point of being deathly pale. The aura that was originally under his complete control became even more chaotic. It began to spread uncontrollably in all directions, covering an area of tens of thousands of miles. This aura was so powerful that it even changed the appearance of time and space, causing the space within a radius of who knows how many tens of thousands of kilometers to seem like the end of the world. It was not just the kind of doomsday caused by the splitting of time and space, but the kind of doomsday that caused all living beings to despair and lose their sense of self. Even if he could only exert the strength of a supreme emperor in this part of the world, this level of strength alone was enough to shake the heavens and the earth. Now, the aura on Luo Fan's body that had lost control was only at the Supreme Emperor level. However, if this Supreme Emperor level aura was placed in another world or another spacetime, it would be enough to create a group of worlds. Here, in this world, although the effect could not be perfectly manifested due to the restrictions of the world and the suppression of the world, it was only natural that the spacetime within a radius of who knew how many tens of thousands of miles would undergo such changes. It's a pity that the strength I can exert is still too weak. I can't hold on until the light of heaven and earth is completely formed. Luo Fan sighed to himself. At this moment, both his body and mind were in an extremely poor state. There was no need to mention his spirit. To construct the light of heaven and earth out of thin air, he had to dig out everything from the depths of his memories in an instant. The instantaneous shock of information almost caused his spirit to completely collapse. However, his spirit was still his original spirit, and his memories were also his original memories. Although he could not manifest its power outside of his body, his essence had not changed much. He would actually only need a little time to recover from the shock to his spirit. Now, the most troublesome thing for him was his body. At this time, his body was almost completely destroyed. In his body, the incomparably complex, perfect, and almost perfect heat circulation system had completely collapsed at this moment. The foundation of the heat circulation system, which could initially make up for all heat loss, had been completely extracted by the light of heaven and earth. All the heat had been completely absorbed by the light of heaven and earth. He had condensed. Under such circumstances, his body had become extremely empty, and not even the slightest bit of extraordinary qualities remained. If it were not for the incredible power that the light of heaven and earth possessed after it was formed, he might not even have the ability to float in the air. Although this process seemed to take a long time, in fact, the entire process lasted less than a blink of an eye. When the light of heaven and earth was formed, the cultivator had just reacted. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed and said, "If you can even withstand this, then I can only admit defeat." After saying that, he pointed his finger. The light of heaven and earth that had just been condensed trembled slightly, and countless roots had already stretched out. In the blink of an eye, they crossed the void and directly arrived around the cultivator, and fiercely pierced into his body. During this process, although the cultivator saw everything clearly, he could only watch as the roots pierced into his body. Gaga 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 sounds continuously came from his body. He actually prepared so many trump cards. If this continues, I'm afraid that I'll really be the one to lose. At this moment, Luo Fan inexplicably rejoiced in his heart. The roots that extended from the light of heaven and earth that he had condensed now were naturally far inferior to the roots that extended from his real light of heaven and earth. If he had to make a comparison, the roots that extended now were at most a billionth of the power of his original roots. However, even if it was only a billionth of the power, it was still the roots of the light of heaven and earth. Its power was ultimately not something that could be withstood by the power of an ordinary god art. At this moment, in his perception, the roots of the light of heaven and earth had already broken through layer after layer of obstructions and continuously penetrated into the cultivator's body. The layers of obstructions were none other than the various powers that the cultivator had condensed after entering this world. Among them, there were some that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with. Over the years, the cultivator had used them before. However, most of them were unfamiliar to Luo Fan, which was the power that the cultivator was still concealing. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan did not pay a huge price to condense the light of heaven and earth, and instead used the various god arts that were condensed from the heat to tangle with the cultivator, it was very likely that Luo Fan would be the first to be at his wits' end. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan could not help but feel secretly satisfied. He was satisfied that he had made the right choice just now. At this moment, the cultivator's expression had already become extremely ugly. Although the battle between him and Luo Fan in the past few years was rather arduous, he still had enough confidence because of the trump cards that he had, and he was certain that he would definitely emerge victorious in the end. But now, under the roots of the light that seemed to be alive, he seemed to have turned into an ordinary person without the grace or power of a human. He was completely unable to resist the other party's attack. He could only watch as the power seeped into his body and destroyed one trump card after another. It destroyed one type of power after another that he had cultivated over countless years. As for the cultivator, even if he raised his willpower to the limit and tried his best to build power, in the end, he could only watch as his power and his trump cards continuously collapsed under the opponent's means. This finally made him feel that failure had touched him. How is this possible? How can I fail? I have already analyzed where the greatest opportunity lies. To me, becoming a true saint is just a matter of time. Why did I fail? The cultivator mumbled. At this moment, the roots of Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth had already destroyed the cultivator's last trump card, and in an instant, it had completely torn his body apart. At this moment, an indescribable power seeped out from the nothingness and began to wrap around the countless pieces that had turned into powder, and with great difficulty, they gathered towards the center. At the same time, a subtle tremor appeared from the deepest part of the nothingness. Be it the rules or the great path, all sorts of subtle powers were produced at this moment, and they began to descend upon this area, intertwining with the power that was causing the countless pieces of powder to begin to gather again, and seeping into every bit of the powder. This is the restriction of heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan, who saw this scene, had an epiphany in his heart. The thing that was trying to make Ah Jing's countless pieces of powder gather again was obviously the true essence of the cultivator. In other words, it was at least the powerful essence of a sixth tribulation, or even a seventh tribulation, eighth tribulation, or even a ninth tribulation powerhouse. After all, the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan had condensed was, after all, an extremely crude simulation. This simulation may have been quite powerful. However, in the end, it was still unable to shake the essence of a sixth tribulation powerhouse. Therefore, although it seemed that the cultivator had been completely wiped out and turned into countless pieces of powder, it was only the level that the cultivator was able to display in this part of the world. In other words, in the eyes of this part of the world, he had only killed the cultivator, but in reality, he had still not shaken the essence of the cultivator. It was precisely because of this that the cultivator would naturally not give up on his own life, and would naturally try his best to use his own essence to reform his own body, so that he could be resurrected. And this would obviously trigger the rules of this part of the world, and in turn, cause this part of the world to descend a punishment. In other words, now, from the depths of the rules and laws, from the great path, that invisible, subtle power seeped out. This, in fact, was the truth of the death penalty. Not long after, the cultivator finally condensed again. It seemed as if nothing had happened, and even the wounds and blood that appeared all over his body when he first appeared in front of Luo Fan had mostly disappeared without a trace. However, at the same time, the power that he had spent who knew how many hundreds of millions of years to obtain had also disappeared without a trace. At this moment, although he looked completely unharmed, and his entire body seemed to be at its peak level, however, he no longer had any power. At this moment, he looked like he had just stepped into this part of the world. In other words, he was completely at the peak state of an ordinary person. It could be said that he had returned to the state before liberation. At this moment, the cultivator looked a little dazed, and the muscles on his body trembled from time to time. So, this is the death penalty. He smiled bitterly, and his expression was full of bitterness. Then, his body began to continuously fall like a stone. This place was dozens of kilometers away from the ground. If an ordinary person really fell like this, it would obviously be obvious that they would only end up turning into minced meat. However, for an existence at the level of this cultivator, even if all of his extraordinary power had been eliminated, and even if he was constantly being punished and tortured, he would not be in any danger because of this. For example, at this moment, when his speed increased to a certain level, he exerted a little force in his legs, and the sound of air explosions erupted under his feet, creating a kind of propulsion force that caused his falling speed to begin to decrease. In the end, when he finally fell to the ground, his speed had already decreased to a level that he could accept, and he directly landed safely. Luo Fan saw his actions, but he had no intention of stopping him at all. As for attacking, he did not even have the slightest intention of attacking. The reason for this was very simple. It was because it was already meaningless. Right now, the cultivator's state could not be any worse. Even if he was killed again, he could still be resurrected, and after resurrection, he would still be like this. His power would not decrease, his mind would not be damaged, and the punishment would not increase. Under such circumstances, what was the point of killing him again? Come to think of it, it would only be a waste of time. With a slight thought, the light of heaven and earth shook slightly, and turned into an extremely solid ball of light. It appeared behind his head, and it began to slowly spin. There seemed to be all kinds of subtle fluctuations constantly spreading in all directions. With the light of heaven and earth, although he no longer had any extraordinary power in his body, his strength had increased compared to before. It was already somewhat comparable to a tribulation stage powerhouse. I'm afraid it will take some time to reform the heat circulation system, and then even longer to increase the heat to its original level. Luo Fan thought to himself. At this moment, a voice came from below. We've been fighting for so long, but we haven't had the chance to communicate with fellow Taoist. Would fellow Taoist be willing to come down for a while? This voice was clearly that of the cultivator. Of course, the other party's voice was quite soft. If it was not for the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan used to guide the voice, he might not have heard it at all. Chapter 26-28. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. Before the memory dissipated, he enveloped it with the light of heaven and earth. Immediately after, the light of heaven and earth trembled slightly, and all the information in the memory entered his heart. He had complete control over it. Hundreds of thousands of geographical locations, the structure of hundreds of thousands of sources of laws, and all the hidden traps instantly appeared in Luo Fan's heart. He could not help but sigh at the vastness of this world once again. Although the distance between these hundreds of thousands of sources of laws was different from that of an ordinary world, it was impossible for them to be so close to each other. The distance between them was still quite considerable. In this way, it went without saying how large the area of these hundreds of thousands of sources of laws was. However, such a vast area was still an insignificant small area compared to the entire world. At least, in the memory, compared to the size of this world, the area occupied by these hundreds of thousands of sources of laws was probably only a billionth of the size of this world. Although it's not a lot, it's enough. Luo Fan was rather satisfied after sorting it out. He was, of course, referring to the sources of laws that were larger than the cold source of laws. Among the hundreds of thousands of sources of laws, most of them were smaller and weaker than the cold source of laws. However, there was also a small portion of 7,000 or 8,000 sources of laws that were stronger than the cold source of laws. This amount was naturally not much compared to the base of hundreds of thousands of sources of laws. However, it was enough for Luo Fan. He nodded at Chu Yao and said, "I'm very satisfied with this reward. Let's begin." As he spoke, a shadow slowly walked out of his body and gradually took shape before appearing in front of Chu Yao. This shadow was naturally one of his clones. The reason why he could create such an incarnation without any extraordinary power was actually very simple. This was because the light of heaven and earth was still expanding and revolving behind him. One must not forget that the light of heaven and earth was a powerful existence that only a fifth tribulation powerhouse could create. In the end, it could even be compared to the great world. For such an existence, it couldn't be easier for him to form an incarnation. Of course, this was because this clone was specifically meant for Chu Yao to kill. So, he'd condensed this clone to an extremely weak state. Not to mention comparing it to his real body, there was even a huge gap between it and ordinary people in the mortal world. Such an incarnation could even kill a baby, not to mention a creature whose physique had already reached the peak of the mortal realm and was only short of extraordinary power. "Then I won't stand on ceremony," Chu Yao said to Luo Fan. In fact, he couldn't wait any longer. If it wasn't for the fact that he had no other choice, he might have already urged Luo Fan to split out a clone for him to kill. Now that he saw that Luo Fan had already created an avatar, and it was such a weak avatar at that, how could he hold back? As soon as he said that, his figure flashed and appeared in front of Luo Fan's clone as if he had teleported. His fist had already landed on the clone's chest. Boom! The clone's body trembled and instantly exploded, turning into countless fragments that dissipated in the void. Whether it was the method of changing positions like shadow shift or the punch that followed, they did not involve any extraordinary power at all. All of these changes were completed by Chu Yao's own physical body. All the power, all the changes, were completed by the strength and skill of the physical body. However, even if that was the case, one could not underestimate its might. If an ordinary creature had not become an itinerant immortal, it would be impossible for them to fight back against him, unless their nature was the same as his. In fact, if it was a weaker itinerant immortal, he might even have to pay a price to deal with it. The moment the clone collapsed, Luo Fan felt an invisible existence descend on him. It was like an invisible sharp blade that directly penetrated his body. However, this invisible sharp blade was rather weak. He only needed to activate his light of heaven and earth slightly, and the sharp blade completely collapsed and disappeared without a trace. He also felt that his body had returned to its original state, and there seemed to be nothing special about him anymore. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan nodded inwardly. Indeed, things were as he had said before. He did not suffer any irreparable damage because of the clone's death. With a thought, he focused his attention on Chu Yao, who was in front of him. Soon, he discovered that Chu Yao's body had completely stabilized at this time. He stood there quietly with an indescribable expression on his face. There was an indescribable joy on his face. He let out a long breath and said, "It's finally gone a little. In this case, there might still be a chance for me to recover." "Congratulations, fellow Taoist," Luo Fan said faintly. At this moment, he could clearly sense that although Chu Yao seemed to have completely recovered on the surface and seemed to have become incomparably healthy, Chu Yao's strength was not as good as before. However, that was only what it looked like on the surface. In reality, the punishment of the heavens and earth still existed within his body. It was still torturing him at every moment. If an ordinary cultivator encountered this, there was a high chance that they would not be able to bear it and choose to leave this world, giving up on the various opportunities in this world. Of course, from another perspective, such a Chu Yao was not a threat to Luo Fan at all. At the very least, he was not a threat for a short period of time. "Thank you for fulfilling my wish, fellow Taoist." Chu Yao sighed. Of course, it was impossible for him to not have any grudges against Luo Fan. However, since things had come to this, he could only forcefully suppress this grudge. After all, such a grudge would not benefit him at all if he revealed it at this moment. Instead, it might bring a great disaster to himself. Luo Fan was naturally aware of the grudge in Chu Yao's heart. At this moment, he only faintly smiled and said, "It's just a deal. Since the deal is done, I won't stay any longer. Goodbye." Immediately, he no longer paid any attention to Chu Yao. His figure was wrapped in the light of the world, and in a flash, he had already soared into the sky. He shot towards the nearest source of laws that was even larger than the cold source of laws. After Luo Fan left, Chu Yao stood in the same spot with an almost indifferent expression on his face. After a long time, he let out a long sigh, and an indescribable hatred flashed in the depths of his eyes. After another long time, the hatred slowly subsided. "Now is not the time for revenge. I have to wait until I completely recover from my cultivation before I have a chance. There's not much time left, and it seems like I can't continue on the previous path. Fortunately, I still hid some of the source of laws. Otherwise, I'm afraid I wouldn't even have a chance to turn things around." That's right, the information about the source of laws that he had given to Luo Fan was not in his possession at all. All the information about the source of laws. He still hid some of the source of laws that he had kept as a backup plan. And this was to deal with the current difficult situation. However, even if he hid some of the source of laws, it did not mean that he could immediately take action and head to the source of laws. After all, he did not have any extraordinary abilities at the moment. Just having 3 meals a day was already a huge problem for him. Not to mention, even if the origin of the laws that he had hidden wasn't in a remote region, it was impossible for it to be in the vicinity. If he wanted to rush over, without sufficient strength or extraordinary abilities, it would be extremely dangerous and could be said to be a surefire way to die. Therefore, at this moment, Chu Yao immediately chose a direction that was far away from where Luo Fan was heading and quickly left this area. In just half a day, before he was driven crazy by the terrifying hunger that this world cast on him, he finally found a decent place to stay. This place was a lake. The lake was not too big, and it was at most a few miles in radius. According to Chu Yao's understanding, such an area would not have an overly powerful life form living here. Looking at the surrounding environment, it was also not an environment where extremely strange life forms should exist. At that moment, he made a decision. Before he obtained some extraordinary abilities, he would stay in this lake. For Chu Yao, he had already been in this world for 78 trillion years. The path that he had taken before was also a path that he had chosen for a greater future. But that's right, I have a deep understanding of how to walk the path of the specialist profession. At this moment, it was really not too difficult to pick up this path. After getting some seafood and eating to his heart's content, he hid in the middle of the lake and relied on his superb physical control to sit cross-legged on the surface of the lake as if he was sitting on flat ground. After that, he began to breathe in a strange rhythm. As he breathed in and out, his body began to produce all sorts of subtle fluctuations. These were fluctuations produced by changing the state of one's body with his breathing. As he continued to adjust his breathing, these fluctuations became more and more obvious. In the end, they even seemed to condense and began to sweep back and forth around his body, causing the originally calm lake below to have circles of fluctuations that continuously spread out in all directions. These fluctuations continued to spread. At a certain moment, these fluctuations trembled slightly and began to quickly retract. In the blink of an eye, they had already retracted into his body and began to surge back and forth in his body. As these surged, the circulation of his qi and blood began to produce subtle changes. His entire body began to gradually heat up. As this happened, Xian's body started to strengthen bit by bit. His body, which was already extremely condensed, was extremely powerful. Both of them started to climb to a higher level, a transcendent height. As these changes occurred, the punishment that existed within his body and this world's existence began to gradually suppress him. The strength of that punishment seemed to become weaker as his body and strength became stronger. The reason for this was very simple. It was because he had already killed the existence that had killed him. At the very least, in the eyes of this world, he had already killed it, even if what he had killed was actually only a part of that existence. Although this world was rather harsh towards extraordinary existences, there was still a chance of survival in the end. After death, killing the existence that had killed him would be able to share the death punishment with the existence that had killed him. In other words, it was reducing the source of the punishment. As the source was reduced, it also allowed the cultivator to gradually suppress it through hard work. In the end, when the cultivator had risen to a certain level, they could even completely eliminate it. Of course, there were corresponding techniques to suppress the death punishment. If one's knowledge and skills were not high enough, it would naturally be impossible to do this. However, it was obvious that Chu Yao, who had lived in this world for a total of 78 trillion years, naturally would not be lacking in knowledge and skills. It was precisely because he had a way to completely eliminate the death punishment that he had directly asked Luo Fan to give him a clone for him to kill. Otherwise, he would not have been willing to pay such a huge price and give up most of his gains over the past 78 trillion years just to reduce the death punishment. At this moment, the method that Chu Yao was using was clearly the method of suppressing the death punishment. These fluctuations surged endlessly within his body like an engine, gradually permeating his entire body and continuously accumulating inside his body. Gradually, it turned from illusory to solid, and in the end, it was gradually brought into his absolute control. As these fluctuations became stronger and more substantial, the ripples on the surface of the water beneath Chu Yao's body began to become more and more chaotic, and also more and more obvious. It was as if the inside of his body was no longer a single source of vibration, but had turned into countless sources of vibration. This process continued continuously. At a certain moment, he let out a long roar towards the sky. His body floated up and completely left the surface of the lake below. Chapter 26-29. At this moment, Chu Yao had already used the energy waves that he had condensed to suppress his own death penalty. After this suppression, although he was still enduring the death penalty, the effect of the penalty could no longer be unleashed. It was like how this world dealt with a cultivator's extraordinary power. With this extraordinary power, I'll be able to recover most of my strength very quickly. In that case, it'll be possible to settle the score for killing me. His eyes flickered with an indescribable radiance. There was viciousness, regret, and pain in his eyes. Evidently, after obtaining his extraordinary power, the hatred he had previously suppressed for Luo Fan had resurfaced. However, this was to be expected. After all, 78 trillion years of hard work had been completely destroyed by the other party. How could this hatred be eliminated so easily? The open-mindedness and indifference he had displayed before was clearly a rational choice made when he did not have the ability. However, it did not mean that he did not care about this at all. Now that he had the ability and the possibility of revenge, how could he completely ignore this hatred? "I only hope that you're a little slower, he mumbled. His eyes seemed to penetrate the void and see the figure that he hated so much. While Chu Yao was working hard to find his extraordinary power, Luo Fan had already arrived at the source of the rules. The source of the rules was not underground, nor was it on the ground. Instead, it was in the sky. It was extremely high up in the sky, where normal living beings could not see it. It was a thundercloud. In the depths of the void, there was a thundercloud that was hidden by countless layers of sky. Even if one looked up from the ground, one would not be able to see it at all. Without the information that Chu Yao had given him, even Luo Fan might have needed hundreds of thousands of years to find this location. The sky above the thundercloud was already at a height that normal living beings couldn't see. At a glance, there was a boundless sea of clouds below. When one looked up, the starry sky was closer than ever, as if this was already the depths of the starry sky. There was an aura of loneliness and transcendence in this place. It was as if there was only this thundercloud left in this world, and he was the only one left in this world. As soon as Luo Fan arrived, he saw the source of the thunder law in the thunderclouds. The source of the thunder rule was extremely huge. If compared to the source of the cold rule, it was at least 9 times the size of the cold rule. Moreover, due to its unique combination and structure, the origin of the lightning laws had an indescribable characteristic. That was, there was no aura being emitted at all. Although it possessed a powerful aura and an unimaginable effect, everything was hidden within the thunderclouds. If not for the fact that Luo Fan had already seen the thundercloud and established a connection with it from a certain mysterious angle, he might not have been able to sense the source of the lightning rule hidden within. This is a good place for cultivation. This thought emerged in his mind. With that thought in mind, his heart trembled slightly, and he had already stepped into the thunderclouds. From the outside, the thundercloud looked like a huge mass of lightning. It spiraled in the void like a huge vortex. Such an existence gave people an indescribable pressure at a glance. It made people wonder what kind of unimaginable blow they would encounter if they were to enter it. However, after stepping into it, the feeling was completely different from what it looked like on the outside. After stepping into it, Luo Fan felt all kinds of indescribable vitality continuously seeping into his body. It constantly surged, combed his body, and combed his qi and blood. At this moment, the heat circulation system that Luo Fan had destroyed when he forcibly condensed the light of heaven and earth began to gradually emerge from nothingness and began to reconstruct in his body. There's actually such an effect? Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could not help but be secretly shocked. Originally, he had already prepared to use the light of heaven and earth to protect himself, then stimulate the source of the heat laws to condense heat again and reconstruct the heat circulation system. However, he did not expect the source of the lightning laws to have such a wonderful effect. It actually possessed such an indescribable healing power. Just by stepping into it, he had already obtained great benefits without even touching the source of the heat laws. As his heat circulation system began to solidify, his own senses began to slowly recover. Originally, he could sense many things that ordinary living beings couldn't. He could even enter the depths of space and sense all sorts of profound energy, matter, and even laws of nature hidden in the depths of space. However, because his own heat circulation system had been completely destroyed, he could only rely on the light of heaven and earth that he had condensed. This kind of perception could be said to be deeper, more direct, and richer than his original perception. However, no matter what, there was still a layer between them. If he did not actively control it, it would not be triggered. In this way, if he did not actively try to sense the situation within the thunderclouds, the light of heaven and earth would naturally not be able to transmit the situation within the thunderclouds to him. However, the senses that Luo Fan had regained were already completely different. This kind of perception had already become a part of his body, and it was a type of his attribute. This was even a type of love that was controlled by his instincts and subconscious. Under such circumstances, if there was anything special in the surroundings, anything that was different from what he knew, he would be able to sense it immediately. It was also because of this that he could sense the uniqueness of the thundercloud in front of him at this moment. It was something special that he had not thought of before. The thunderclouds were a strange domain. It was a strange domain that was similar to a complete continent. In this domain, there were many lightning creatures living in it. These lightning living beings were spread throughout the entire domain. At a glance, it seemed like all the living beings that existed in the normal world could be found. However, these living beings existed in the form of lightning. For example, at this moment, Luo Fan discovered that there was a long lightning snake not far away from his feet. This lightning snake was circling in that position, but it did not think about Luo Fan's arrival at all. It only glanced at him calmly before it once again sank into the countless lightning bolt. The countless lightning living beings circled around the center, forming concentric circles. At the center of the circle was the source of the lightning law. Countless lightning bolts were constantly being released from the source of the lightning law, and they were completely broken down and devoured by the surrounding divine dragons, Chilants, and other mythological beasts. After that, some lightning bolts were discharged and devoured by the living beings behind them layer by layer. In this manner, the lightning was stacked layer by layer, and the quality of the lightning was clearly worse the further one went. However, this was clearly enough for the lightning living beings in the outer layer. In this way, a complete ecological balance was formed. Looking at this extremely complex and complete ecology, Luo Fan could not help but sigh in admiration. As expected of the source of the laws, every single one of them has its own wonders. With a thought, he began to head towards the source of the laws in the inner layer. The deeper he went, the denser the vitality, and the greater the benefits he received. The heat circulation system in his body reappeared faster and faster, and it became more and more solid. Vaguely, heat energy was constantly being derived from the heat circulation system. Because the extraordinary power in the heat energy was stimulated by him, and even constructed by him, the heat energy that was born from the heat circulation system was the kind of heat that already possessed extraordinary characteristics. In other words, it was the kind of heat energy that was similar to magic power. For him, the birth of such heat energy was like his body was constantly being sublimated. In this instant, the aura that his entire body emitted began to strengthen continuously. To the surrounding lightning living beings, this strengthening of aura was like a powerhouse beginning to continuously sublimate and evolve, and it began to step into the inner layer. However, such a situation was in line with the rules of the lightning domain. In this thunder domain, whether the lightning creatures were in the inner layer or the outer layer depended entirely on their strength. The stronger they were, the more innermost they could occupy. In the end, when they were strong enough, they could push away the divine beasts like the divine dragons and phoenixes in the innermost layer and occupy their positions. In this way, Luo Fan's continuous strengthening of aura was in line with his continuous movement towards the inner layer. Due to this, those living beings did not stop him even though he was continuously advancing. Instead, they all looked at Luo Fan in awe and watched as Luo Fan stepped into the inner layer. As for the lightning living beings in the inner layer who had accepted his challenge, perhaps some of them wanted to fight him and stop him, but before they could react, Luo Fan had already crossed this layer and disappeared from their sphere of influence. In this way, Luo Fan was naturally able to advance to the next level without any injuries. In this situation, Luo Fan went all the way to the innermost layer, where the divine beasts like the divine dragons, cheilants, and phoenixes were, before he was stopped by many lightning divine beasts. These thunderbolt divine beasts stared at Luo Fan with warning gazes, their eyes filled with killing intent. It was as if they were saying, "If you continue to advance, we'll tear you apart." At this moment, although the heat circulation system in Luo Fan's body had not fully recovered, his heat had recovered quite a lot. The recovered heat had a powerful effect, allowing him to instantly obtain strength that was comparable to a false saint. In this situation, he could easily suppress all the lightning living beings in front of him without the help of the light of heaven and earth. Moreover, he still had the light of heaven and earth. In this situation, he only smiled faintly in the face of these warning gazes. With a slight thought, he released a powerful aura and instantly suppressed the lightning living beings in front of him. As his aura suppressed them, the lightning living beings seemed to have turned into the most ordinary living beings and were facing a natural enemy that could easily tear them apart. In the face of such an aura, these living beings were all shocked and cowardly gazes appeared in their eyes. Immediately after, they made way for an empty space. In front of Luo Fan, all the way to the center, where the source of the Thunder Law was located, was an empty and spacious area. Seeing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and did not take the previous development to heart. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, directly entering the source of the Thunderbolt Law. At this moment, the surrounding lightning living beings were all dumbfounded. They were living beings that were born from the thunderclouds, so their understanding of the source of the Thunderbolt Law was far beyond the imagination of other living beings. They could not be more aware of how terrifying the source of the Thunderbolt Law was. Usually, they could only absorb the traces of thunderbolts released from the source of the Thunderbolt Law with the help of many divine beasts. As for the living beings behind them, they had to absorb the thunderbolt impurities that the divine beasts did not want. But now, there was actually someone who charged into the source of the Thunderbolt Law without stopping. To them, this was simply like a paper doll throwing itself into a fire. Is he crazy? This thought appeared in the minds of many divine beasts at this moment, causing their expressions to change. They somewhat regretted being calculative with a fool. At this moment, Luo Fan naturally did not know that he had become a lunatic and a fool in the eyes of those divine beasts. At this moment, he began to frantically absorb the endless vitality around him. It was the vitality that was born from the thunderbolt. The vitality surged into his body like a mountain torrent, constantly stimulating his body and making his body take the initiative to form the heat circulation system. Chapter 26:30. As the circulation system took shape, the faint stimulation from the source of the laws of lightning on the heat in his body began to strengthen. Of course, another way of putting it would be more accurate. That was, Luo Fan's perception of this stimulation was becoming clearer and clearer. Faced with such a situation, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. The facts had already proven his previous thoughts. The heat in his body needed to be stimulated by a larger and stronger source of laws in order to have a reaction. As his perception deepened, he gradually sensed that there was a hidden world in the depths of the source of the laws of lightning. He was able to sense the faint presence of Chu Yao's aura in this world. Obviously, this world was similar to the world of ice that existed at the origin of the laws of cold, and both of them were created by Chu Yao. However, even though they came from the same origin, there was a huge difference between this world and the frigid ice world from back then. The icy world back then was complete and flawless. Whether it was its structure, power, or even the laws within it, they had all reached an almost perfect state. However, the world hidden in the depths of the source of the laws of lightning was completely different. Currently, this world was extremely dilapidated. It felt as if it was formed from pieces of the world that had been placed together. Even Chu Yao's aura that existed in the world seemed to be slowly dissipating. As for Chu Yao's clone that had originally existed, there was no longer any trace of its existence. With a slight thought, Luo Fan, under the protection of the light of heaven and earth, directly crossed through the layers of barriers and appeared in front of that world. After arriving, he made a grabbing motion in the air. The dilapidated world instantly separated from its original location and began to shrink rapidly. Not long after, it had shrunk to the size of a palm and landed in his hand. As he put the world away, the vitality that had been continuously pouring into his body instantly increased by more than 100 times. With the sudden strengthening of this vitality, the heat circulation system in his body was completely formed. Endless heat was born from this heat circulation system and began to circulate endlessly in his body along the heat circulation system. As the heat circulation system recovered, an indescribable feeling of power emerged from the bottom of his heart. In an instant, Luo Fan understood that he had completely recovered from all the injuries he had suffered when condensing the light of the world. Now, not only had his body recovered to its peak, but he also had an additional ray of light of the world. Compared to before, his strength had increased tremendously. If he really had to make a comparison, then the strength he could bring out in this world should be comparable to a tribulation stage expert. As he felt this, Luo Fan let out a long breath, and the indescribable pressure in his heart suddenly dissipated. If I choose to enter that world now, it shouldn't be too dangerous. This thought emerged in his mind. The reason why he had chosen to come to the origin of the laws instead of directly touching the invitation letter and entering the world indicated by the invitation letter was because he had felt an indescribable pressure in his heart. This pressure made him understand that if he entered that world in that state, what awaited him in the end would definitely not be a happy ending. This feeling wasn't very strong. Perhaps it was just an illusion, an unnecessary worry caused by the great reduction in his strength. However, as an existence at the level of Luo Fan, even if he didn't believe in anything else, it was impossible for him to not believe in his own feelings. If you don't even believe in your own feelings, how can you expect to face the chaotic state that you can't even imagine? How can you expect to achieve the eternal and indestructible true saint realm that you can't even imagine? Therefore, even if this worry was just a misconception, a mental pressure caused by the great reduction in strength, Luo Fan did not have any thoughts of disobeying it. This was the reason why he had chosen to come to the origin of the laws of thunder. The reality had also proven that his choice was correct. After all, if he had not chosen to come here, how could he have recovered the heat circulation system in his body so easily? How could he have completely recovered his originally damaged strength so easily? With a slight thought, Luo Fan released his senses and vaguely sensed that there was a mysterious law that was connected to the origin of the laws of thunder. The mysterious law was so mysterious, so profound, and so obscure. Even though he was already in the depths of the origin of the laws of thunder and could be said to have completely grasped the life and death of the origin of the laws of thunder, he still could not clearly grasp this connection. He could only vaguely sense the existence of this connection. He could sense that there were countless extremely distant existences that were vaguely connected to the origin of the laws of thunder. What is this? This thought appeared in his mind at this moment. These were connections that were not mentioned in Chu Yao's memories. Perhaps there are still many secrets hidden in the origin of the laws of thunder. He pondered as an eager expression appeared on his face. Although he had chosen the origin of the laws of thunder casually, it could also be said to be a choice that he had made based on his intuition. Originally, just the influx of infinite vitality that allowed his heat circulation system to recover quickly was already worth the price. However, there was actually such an unexpected connection now. This could be considered a pleasant surprise. How could he not be happy? However, the connection was simply too deep and obscure. Even though Luo Fan could vaguely sense it now, it was still difficult for him to grasp its direction and grasp what it was connected to. Only when he had a deeper understanding of the origin of the laws of thunder, and when he had a better grasp of the origin of the laws of thunder, Would he be able to turn the impossible into the possible and completely grasp these connections? Vaguely, Luo Fan's intuition told him that if he could grasp this connection, perhaps it would be extremely beneficial to him. In fact, it might even be more beneficial than entering the world that the invitation letter pointed to. With this thought in mind, what he had to do next was already very obvious. Immediately, Luo Fan sat cross-legged where the world of thunder had originally been. He began to open up his body, allowing the origin of the laws of heat in his body to directly come into contact with the origin of the laws of thunder in the outside world. A strong resonance appeared between the two. The origin of the laws of heat, which had originally been decomposed to the extreme by him and reached a level that could not be further refined, immediately began to decompose further. All sorts of details that were originally extremely blurry and could not even be seen clearly became more and more obvious during this resonance. In the end, they completely occupied his attention. After discovering this, Luo Fan naturally did not hesitate, and began to comprehend the details of the origin of the laws of heat. He continuously analyzed the principles and mysteries that existed within them, and integrated them into the heat in his body. They were then absorbed by his worldview and turned into nutrients for the growth and perfection of his worldview. When the origin of the laws of heat in Luo Fan's body resonated with the origin of the laws of thunder in the outside world, the entire origin of the laws of thunder also underwent a subtle change. Vaguely, there seemed to be some kind of heat aura gradually emerging throughout the entire thundercloud. The countless lightning creatures that existed in the thundercloud also felt that the environment they were in seemed to have undergone some indescribable changes at this moment. It seemed like the originally pure external environment had unknowingly become a little more complicated. Many creatures even began to have many thoughts that they shouldn't have. As their way of thinking changed, they were gradually dissatisfied with the position that they had been in before. Because of this dissatisfaction, friction naturally began to gradually appear. When friction appeared, battles followed. Gradually, the originally calm thunderclouds fell into an indescribable state of chaos. The concentric circles of activity that had originally been fixed for countless years were gradually disrupted. Boom, 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 boom. Following this change, the originally stable thundercloud began to distort inexplicably. The originally smooth whirlpool gradually changed, gradually transforming into a real, irregular thundercloud. Vaguely, the originally obscure and deep connection seemed to have become even more obscure and profound. If Luo Fan had sensed such an obscure and deep connection at the beginning, he might not have had much chance to sense the existence of these connections. Of course, it was naturally different at this time. Since he already knew that there was a connection, then under the condition that the nature of the connection did not change, an existence at Luo Fan's level would naturally be able to lock onto this connection. No matter how obscure and deep this connection became, he would still be able to sense the existence of that connection. Of course, sensing its existence was one thing, and truly grasping this connection was another matter. Time flew by, and before he knew it, 10 years had passed. On this day, a living being appeared outside the thunderclouds. This creature was surrounded by fluctuations, and his entire body seemed to have materialized from the fluctuations. He floated in the air, and the surrounding space-time seemed to have turned into fluctuations. As he breathed, indescribable ripples were produced, constantly spreading in all directions. This figure was none other than Chu Yao. At this moment, in the eyes of this world, Chu Yao's essence had already been raised to the false saint stage. The fluctuations condensed in his body had also been given strong transcendent characteristics by him. At this moment, with these transcendent characteristics, he could already unleash strength that was at least tens of millions of times greater than his original strength in this world. This kind of strength was already comparable to that of a supreme emperor. As expected, he's here. This is the best place to heal. It seems that he really suffered quite a lot of injuries back then. Chu Yao looked at the thundercloud in front of him and sneered. The various information about the source of the laws that he had given to Luo Fan back then was naturally not fake. For existences at their level, they would be able to instantly detect any trace of falsification. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for him to falsify the information he had given. However, even if there was no falsification, he could still use some techniques to conceal some things and guide some things. For example, the source of the Thunderbolt laws was the source of the laws that he had used various methods to guide Luo Fan here. As long as Luo Fan was as he had guessed, and had also suffered quite a bit of damage. Scram! At this moment, Chu Yao was about to say something when he suddenly heard a soft shout in his ears. Immediately after, an extremely terrifying power was suddenly born from nothingness and crushed his body fiercely, causing the fluctuations around his body to completely collapse at this moment. Even the source of the fluctuations in his body could not withstand it, and kept cracking under the pressure of this power. Immediately after, it completely collapsed in the next moment. Endless fluctuations erupted from his body at this moment, directly shattering the surrounding void. In the blink of an eye, his body seemed to have turned into a firework, directly exploding into countless pieces. What's going on? Why is he so much stronger than before? At this moment, Chu Yao's heart was filled with disbelief. He felt that his worldview had been overturned. From those two words, he could already clearly tell that the person who had spoken and attacked him was Luo Fan, whom he thought he had schemed against back then. However, the level of strength that the other party displayed was tens of thousands of times stronger than the Luo Fan he knew back then. It felt like comparing the current Luo Fan and the current Luo Fan was like comparing an ant to a divine dragon. Chapter 26:31. It was a world. A strange, vast, and boundless world filled with the source of endless laws. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly came to a realization, and his expression became strange. Isn't this the world that the invitation letter is pointing to? He had not expected that the source of the Thunderbolt laws would actually be connected to that world. He had originally thought that it would be connected to some sort of punishment or some sort of extraordinary thing like the Thunder Calamity. He had not expected that the final destination would actually be that world that seemed to be the final secret of this world. Do these laws originate from that world, or is it the other way around? Is that world supported by the source of all sorts of laws? This doubt surfaced in his heart. As he came into contact with that world, he suddenly realized that there seemed to be an invisible barrier in front of him. This barrier was so subtle that it seemed like he could step into that mysterious world as long as he broke it. What's the difference between entering that world like this and directly using the invitation letter? This doubt surfaced in his heart. However, although this was what he thought, he had already made up his mind. He was going to rely on himself to break this barrier and enter that world. Although it was easier and simpler to use the invitation letter, it was obvious that the sense of achievement that using the invitation letter to enter that world was worlds apart from the sense of achievement of directly breaking the barrier to enter that world. Moreover, he vaguely guessed that if he used the invitation letter to enter that world, he would perhaps encounter some kind of shackles that he would not encounter if he broke the barrier to enter that world. As various thoughts flashed through his mind, a faint smile appeared on his face. Without any visible movement, his light of earth trembled slightly and turned into an invisible fist that blasted towards the barrier in front of him. Crack, 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 an earth-shattering sound came from the barrier at this moment. Following this sound, the entire Thunderbolt law source began to shake violently, as if a powerful invisible force was grabbing onto the Thunderbolt law source and shaking it continuously. In contrast to the trembling of the Thunderbolt law source, the thunderclouds outside the Thunderbolt law source also began to churn violently. The ecological balance system that had originally stabilized was once again shaken at this moment. It was unknown how many lightning creatures had their powers changed because of this turbulence, becoming stronger or weaker. Regardless of whether it was strengthening or weakening, it would obviously change the power balance between them, and this change in power balance would obviously cause the ecological balance system that was originally maintained by the power balance to readjust. Of course, this was only the beginning. The real chaos and adjustment would not appear so quickly. What appeared now could only be considered an omen at most. However, this was obviously meaningless to Luo Fan. At this time, he just urged the light of the earth to bombard the barrier again and again, causing more and more cracks to appear on the barrier due to his bombardment. The cracks grew bigger and bigger. In the end, at a certain moment, the barrier in front of him completely collapsed with a loud bang, revealing a strange hole. A hole that leads to another world, sure enough. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan thought to himself and stepped into the hole. In the process of passing through the hole, he felt as if he was advancing to a brand new, higher dimension. The feeling of his body being sublimated at every moment was so wonderful that he was almost addicted to it. By the time he came back to his senses, he had already appeared in a strange world. Light and shadow flowed in this world, as if it was a greater, deeper, and more complicated source of laws. Although there was land, mountains, rivers, flowers, trees, insects, fish, birds, beasts, and all other things that existed in a normal world, everything that existed in this world was just an appearance. However, all of this was just an appearance that had evolved from the source of some kind of rule. Everything seemed to be just a part of this vast and boundless source of the laws. This is that world? Looking at this scene, even though Luo Fan had expected this, he could not help but be shocked. Compared to this world, all the source of laws that he had come into contact with before, including the source of the lightning law, were so insignificant. Putting everything else aside, at this moment, he could already feel that the source of the heat law in his body had become extremely thin, to a depth that he could not imagine. It was as long as he was willing, he could sense the source of laws through this resonance that was billions of times finer than the smallest heat law that he could sense now. Just this change alone was enough for Luo Fan to completely place the 200 million years before the seventh calamity in this world. What an unbelievable world! After a long time, he let out a long sigh. After recovering a little, he began to pay attention to the various auras around him. At this moment, he had already discovered the biggest difference between this world and the world outside. Originally, cultivators were extremely rare in that world, but here they were densely packed. Previously, outside this world, he had only seen a few dozen cultivators in the past tens of thousands of years. However, at this moment, he had only entered this world for a short period of time, but he had already sensed the auras of tens of thousands of cultivators scattered all around him. It seems that there are more cultivators in this world than I imagined. With a slight thought, Luo Fan suddenly sensed an aura coming from afar. Not long after, that aura had already arrived nearby. Luo Fan looked over and saw that it was a strange creature. It had 3 legs, 6 arms, 12 eyes, and a mouth like that of a frog. Such an appearance should have been rather ugly, but the feeling that this creature gave Luo Fan did not match the feeling of ugliness at all. Instead, it displayed a kind of harmonious charm that made people feel that it was rather charming. Evidently, this was also a predecessor Dao physique of a certain land. As expected, there is a new fellow cultivator. I am Liang Feng. Greetings, fellow cultivator. The cultivator smiled and said to Luo Fan. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. Since the other party had shown goodwill, he naturally was not the type to forcefully argue with them and introduced himself. At this moment, the cultivator descended and said to Luo Fan, "Fellow cultivator is the first fellow cultivator to enter this world of laws in tens of thousands of years, so you must have a lot of questions about this world of laws. I have some information here that fellow cultivators should be interested in." As he spoke, The cultivator raised his hand and pointed. A speck of light rushed out from his hand and directly arrived before Luo Fan. Luo Fan faintly smiled. After thanking the shop, he received the spirit light. In an instant, a large amount of memories flowed into his mind through the light. In the blink of an eye, he already knew a lot of common knowledge about this world. So there is such a mysterious thing hidden in this world. If I can really obtain it, becoming a true sage is a bit of an exaggeration, but I'm afraid my cultivation will improve greatly. After understanding all the common knowledge, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. Naturally, the reason why this world could attract so many cultivators was not just because of the convergence of the essences of laws within this world. After all, different cultivators chose different paths of cultivation. Some cultivators attached great importance to the origin of laws, such as Luo Fan. Others, such as Chu Yao. Some cultivators, on the other hand, were completely disdainful of the origins of the laws. For example, this cultivator called Liang Fong. 4 cultivators who cared about the origin of laws. Just the special characteristics of the origin of laws in this world was enough to make them scramble like a flock of duck. They would even be willing to spend an endless amount of time in this place. However, for cultivators who did not care about the origin of laws, this alone was clearly not enough to attract them into this world. It was not enough to make them spend a large amount of time in this world. The reason why cultivators who did not care about the origin of laws were willing to spend a large amount of time in this world was actually very simple. That was because, somewhere in this world there was some sort of treasure hidden. This kind of treasure was not a magic treasure at all. It did not have the various magical effects of a magic treasure, nor did it have the various unbelievable powers of a magic treasure. It only had one effect, and that was to let cultivators experience the true sage realm in advance. It was said that as long as one obtained this kind of treasure, even if one was not a cultivator, as long as one was a living creature, they would be able to personally experience the true sage realm for a certain period of time through it. They would be able to obtain the power of a true sage and understand all principles and mysteries from the perspective of a true sage. These cultivators who did not care about the origin of laws obviously entered this world for this kind of treasure. However, this kind of treasure was extremely difficult to find. Since ancient times, no one knew how many trillions of cultivators had entered this world over the billions of years. However, in the end, no one even knew if there was anyone who obtained this kind of treasure. It was said that there might be 1 or 2 cultivators who obtained this kind of opportunity and obtained this kind of treasure. However, that was only a rumor. No one could produce any credible evidence to prove this point. If it was not for the fact that the existence of this kind of treasure was deeply engraved in the depths of the various laws of this world, and one could obtain this information just by slightly understanding the laws of this world, many cultivators might have doubted the existence of this kind of treasure. That's right. Fellow cultivator, may I know where you obtained the invitation to enter this world this time? The cultivator heard Luo Fan's lament and asked with a smile. When Luo Fan heard this, he instantly knew that the kindness that he showed previously was because of this question. I did get an invitation letter, but I didn't use it. Instead, I used a certain method to find the barrier of this world, then broke the barrier to enter this world. Luo Fan did not hide his method of entry and said plainly. Although the cultivator in front of him was quite powerful and perhaps had an extremely high innate quality, in this world, his strength was only about the same as Chu Yao's. In fact, from a certain perspective, he was even weaker than Chu Yao. Such an existence did not pose any threat to him at all. If he wanted to, he could easily crush the other party with a single slap. Under such circumstances, he was naturally not worried that the cultivator in front of him would find out about his information and pose any threat to him at all. Moreover, from the various attitudes of the other party, the method that he used to enter this world might not be a unique secret. After thinking about it, it actually made sense. The cultivators who could enter this world were definitely not ordinary powerhouses. They must be extremely powerful and must have reached a certain depth in the tribulation transcendence realm. It was not an exaggeration to say that any of these existences were geniuses. Based on what Luo Fan could sense, there were already tens of thousands of cultivators in the vicinity. Given the size of this world, the number of cultivators in this world would likely have to be calculated in the billions or even trillions. Among so many geniuses, could it be that not 1 in 10 million cultivators entered this world using the same method as him? As long as 1 in 10 million cultivators entered this world using the same method as him, then the number was already quite considerable. With so many cultivators choosing the same method, it was obviously not a big secret. It was precisely because of these considerations that he was so calm and honest at this moment. After hearing Luo Fan's words, the 12 eyes of the cultivator suddenly burst out with a strong light, and he said with some disbelief, "Fellow Taoist actually broke the shackles and entered this world by yourself? Fellow Taoist, please don't joke around." Luo Fan only smiled and said, "Why would I joke around? The general knowledge that fellow Taoist gave just now didn't include any special meaning in the method I used. If I didn't know this, why would I joke around with this?" Hearing this, Liang Fong said repeatedly, "Yes, yes, yes, I was rash. It's really because fellow Taoist's words are too shocking that I can't control myself. Please forgive me, fellow Taoist." Chapter 2632. Fellow Taoist, do you know what this world looks like in my eyes? Liang Fong did not directly answer Luo Fan's question. Instead, he asked a question in return. Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly taken aback. He had a vague guess in his heart. He shook his head and said, "I have some guesses, but I'm not sure about the specifics." Liang Fong sighed and said, "It's hard to describe the specifics clearly. You'll know once you feel it for yourself." As he spoke, he did not hesitate. A speck of spiritual light appeared in his hand and floated in front of Luo Fan. On the surface, this speck of spiritual light looked the same as the previous spiritual light that contained memories and information. However, that was obviously only on the surface. On the inside, the nature of this spiritual light was completely different from the previous spiritual light. The previous spiritual light was the condensation of memories, but this spiritual light was the condensation of perception. As long as he received this spiritual light, Luo Fan would be able to instantly sense the other party's perception for a period of time. This was the most direct way to know the other party's perception and perception of the world. Luo Fan was not surprised by this method. After all, this ability was only a trick. Even those who had not become immortals could do it if they were skilled, let alone existences like Luo Fan and this cultivator. At that moment, he simply accepted the spiritual light. As soon as the spiritual light entered his hand, he felt an indescribable perception enter his heart. In a trance, he felt the world in his eyes change in various ways. The originally clear source of the various laws had completely disappeared. This world of laws had actually become like a normal world at this moment. At a glance, the living beings that were originally the source of rules had become real living beings. The feeling of being the source of rules had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. Only the auras of the cultivators in the surroundings vaguely contained the aura of the source of rules. Compared to the place outside this world, this place was naturally much denser. Moreover, the aura of the source of rules was also much stronger. However, compared to his own perspective, where there was no place that was not the source of the rules and the profound mysteries of cultivation, there was a world of difference. So, this is the consequence of accepting the invitation and stepping into this world? Luo Fan murmured. His eyes were filled with surprise, realization, and an indescribable sense of relief. As of now, Luo Fan could not feel where this limitation came from at all. He could only feel that the restriction was similar to the restriction on the use of his extraordinary power. It was an absolute and untraceable restriction. In a situation where he couldn't find a way to restrict it, it was almost impossible to break through this restriction. At the very least, even Luo Fan couldn't think of any way to break through this restriction. After all, it was as if one's strength had not reached a certain level. The world in one's eyes, the perception in one's heart, and even everything else had not reached a certain standard. As a result, the world that one saw was not the truth of the world. Even if Luo Fan thought that his understanding of cultivation had reached an unimaginable level, he was obviously at his wits' end in the face of such restrictions. Fortunately, I didn't choose that invitation. Luo Fan thought to himself as he broke away from that perception. As he broke away from that perception, the familiar scene of the source of the endless rules in his surroundings was brought into his perception again. At this moment, he suddenly felt that the resonance between the heat law source in his body and the endless rules in the outside world had become stronger. Even if he didn't use his heart to experience it, countless mysteries were released from it on their own, fusing into his heat, fusing into his body, and turning into resources for the growth of his view of the world. There's an unexpected gain. Sensing that he had obtained such a benefit, Luo Fan was secretly delighted. This kind of situation was actually quite normal. If one was always immersed in a certain wonderful feeling, there naturally wouldn't be too much of an impact. However, if one were to suddenly break away from the wonderful feeling for a period of time and then fall back into that wonderful feeling again, the wonderful feeling would instantly become even more wonderful. After stepping into this world, he had been constantly sensing the omnipresent source of the rules in this world. He could feel the heat law source in his body being stimulated at all times and resonating with everything in the outside world. It was quite wonderful, allowing him to surpass the cultivation effects that could only be achieved by using all means and focusing all his attention in the past. However, it was precisely because he was in this state from the beginning that he gradually got used to this state deep in his heart. He even treated it as normal, not thinking that it was rare and wonderful. It was only when he felt the world in the eyes of others again and sensed the senses after being restricted that he came to a sudden realization. It turned out that this feeling was so rare, and it turned out that this feeling of constantly being stimulated by the endless rules in the outside world was so wonderful. This sudden realization led to great enlightenment in his heart at this moment. In this instant, he didn't even need to use his mind to release countless principles and mysteries, turning them into nutrients for his growth. Looks like you already know. It's a pity that I was too impatient back then and immediately entered this world after receiving the invitation. Otherwise, Liang Fong sighed as he spoke. I didn't expect there to be such a difference. Looks like my luck is not bad. Luo Fan collected his thoughts and smiled. Liang Fong looked at Luo Fan with great envy, as if he could not wait to take Luo Fan with him. However, it was clear that he was still rational in the end. After a short while, he suppressed this impulse and said with a helpless expression, Actually, I've already thought it through. This isn't luck, but the heart of the way. Luo Fan only smiled and did not dwell on this issue. He only said, Thank you for telling me. If it wasn't for you, who knows how long it would take for me to figure this out. However, I don't know why you took the initiative to come here. What are your thoughts? Luo Fan did not use words to probe the other party and reveal the other party's intentions bit by bit. His time was very precious, especially since he had just stepped into this world. As for why he was so sure of what the other party was thinking, there was no need to say much. A cultivator who could cultivate to this stage would obviously not do things without a goal. He was indeed the first cultivator to step into this world in the past tens of thousands of years, but so what? To others, no matter what, he was just a newcomer. What effect would it have on those who came before him? Normal cultivators would obviously ignore him. Under such circumstances, this Liang Fong before him took the initiative to directly give him knowledge and told him about the advantages he had. If he did not have any thoughts, then it was simply an insult to his intelligence. At that moment Liang Fang only smiled and said, "Don't misunderstand, fellow Taoist. This time, I'm only here to form some good karma with fellow Taoists. I don't have any other plans that go overboard. After all, the effort and the reward must be equal." Hearing this, Luo Fan had already completely understood. As for whether he could do well in this world, Liang Fang actually did not have much confidence. As for how well he would do if he did well, he did not have too many expectations. As for whether he could obtain the treasure that could allow him to experience the true divine realm in the end, this was just an empty statement, and he did not have any hope. At this time, he came to communicate with Luo Fan at most to familiarize himself with him. If there were any benefits in the future, he hoped that Luo Fan would remember that there was such a person. After understanding this, he was also relieved. At that moment, he did not have any ill feelings because the other party did not have much confidence in him. It was just that after communicating with this Liang Fang for a few days, he understood some of the unwritten rules of this world that Liang Fang had not included in the common sense. Liang Fang was obviously not averse to communicating with Luo Fan. Over the past few days, he had told him everything he knew without holding back. He had told Luo Fan everything he wanted to know without holding back. This allowed Luo Fan to be like an old bird in just a few days. After a few days, Liang Fang looked at the weather and said to Luo Fan, "There will be a wave of laws appearing next, and it is a good time to cultivate. I will not stay any longer. Goodbye." The wave of laws was a unique phenomenon in this world. In this world, there were too many sources of laws, and the relationship between those sources of laws was extremely complicated. Therefore, the sources of laws would interact with each other to produce various natural phenomena. For example, the wave of laws was one of the most common natural phenomena. In this world, after a certain period of time, countless sources of laws would release the conflicting forces that had accumulated over a period of time, causing a certain area of the source of laws to produce chaos of varying intensity. Under such chaos, the originally stable state that cultivators who entered this world with invitations would not be able to sense the hidden source of laws would completely reveal itself in a certain period of time. This was nothing for existences like Luo Fan, but for other cultivators, it was an excellent opportunity to cultivate. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally did not ask him to stay. He immediately said, "I see. I hope that you will be able to gain a lot from this." Hearing this, Liang Fang smiled and took his leave. Not long after Liang Fang left, there was a roar in the sky. After that, the ground started to tremble as well. It seemed like some sort of peerlessly powerful force was shaking the entire world, shaking all the details and elements that made up this entire world. The originally stable state of the countless sources of laws began to disintegrate in Luo Fan's eyes. The original appearance of the normal world became extremely strange in the blink of an eye, as if the entire world had been distorted. So, this is the wave of laws. An inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face when he saw this. With a thought, his figure was already high up in the sky. Looking up, there were waves of ripples constantly appearing and disappearing on the ground below and in the sky above. The center of those ripples was not a single one. Instead, it was like rain covering all areas. The ripples intertwined and affected each other, appearing extremely chaotic. It really is a wave. Looking at all this, Luo Fan had an inexplicable feeling. At this moment, in various locations where Luo Fan had sensed the auras of cultivators, those auras began to surge. The auras that were originally only faintly discernible now had their presence skyrocketing tens of thousands of times. Waves of aura rushed up, directly twisting the void into pieces. Like a huge sheet of paper, it covered the surrounding void, as if it wanted to bring as much space as possible into its control. Of course, fortunately, it was only as if they wanted to. They did not really want to bring all space-time into their control. Otherwise, with so many auras overlapping with each other, a war between cultivators would have broken out. According to what Liang Fang had said, this kind of wave of laws could usually last for a few days. Then, it could be a few years, a few decades, or even a few hundred years before it happened again. Looking into the distance, the wave of laws was only within a few million miles. Beyond that, the world returned to peace. Obviously, the wave of laws was limited to this area. However, at this time, there were no cultivators in the peaceful area outside that had a radius of a few million miles. As for the reason, Luo Fan was quite clear about it from Liang Fang's previous explanation. That was because this kind of wave of laws would not be limited to a single location. Once it appeared, it would continue to spread everywhere and eventually spread to the entire world, causing the entire world to experience a similar kind of chaos before it would calm down. As a result, the cultivators only needed to wait in their cave abode. Very soon, the waves would spread to where they were. It would be more efficient for them to come to this place to fight for a place to comprehend the source of the various laws. It would be more efficient for them to just stay in their cave abodes and make preparations. It was precisely because of this that this place seemed so peaceful at this time.